Chapter 11 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy. Chapter 11. The bedside comweb warned her politely that it was now 10 minutes to dive point. Waking passengers who experienced subspace distress in any form could obtain immediate assistance by a call on any comweb. If they preferred, they could have their cabins kept under the continuous visual supervision of their personal steward or stewardess. The Dawn City's passenger area still looked rather well populated when Trigger arrived, but some of the passengers were showing signs of regretting their decision to stay awake. Presently, she became aware of a faint queasiness herself. It wasn't bad. Mainly a sensation as if the ship were trying continuously to turn over on its axis around her and not quite making it, and she knew from previous experience that after the first hour or so she would be completely free of that. She walked into a low, dimly lit, very swank-looking gambling room, still well patronized by the hardier section of her fellow travelers, searching for a place where she could sit down unobtrusively for a while and let the subspace reaction work itself out. A couch beside a closed door near the unlit end of the room seemed about right for the purpose. Trigger sat down and glanced around. There were a variety of games in progress, all unfamiliar to her. The players were mostly men, but a remarkable number of beautiful women, beautifully gowned, stood around the tables as observers. Travelers' companions, Trigger realized suddenly. The Dawn City's employees naturally would be inured to subspace effects. From the scraps of talk she could pick up, the stakes seemed uniformly high. A swirl of vertigo suddenly built up in her again. This one was stronger than most. For a moment, she couldn't be sure whether she was going to be sick or not. She stood up, stepped over to the door a few feet away, pulled it open and went through, drawing it shut behind her. There had been a shielding black light screen in the doorway. On the other side was bottled sunshine. She found herself on a long balcony which overlooked a formal garden enclosure 30 feet below. There was no one else in sight. She leaned back against the wall beside the door, closed her eyes, and breathed slowly and deeply for some seconds. The sickish sensation began to fade. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the little yellow man. He stood motionless at the far end of the garden, next to some flowering shrubbery out of which he might have just stepped. He seemed to be peering along the sand path which curved in toward the balcony and vanished beneath it, below the point where Trigger stood. It was sheer fright which immobilized her at first, because there was not anything really human about that small, squat, man-shaped figure. A dwarfish yellow demon he seemed, evil and menacing. The garden, she realized suddenly, might be an illusion scene. Or else. The thing moved in that instant. It became a blur of motion along the curving path and disappeared under the balcony. After a second or so, she heard the sound of a door closing some distance away. The garden lay still again. Trigger stayed where she was, her knees shaking a little. The fright appeared to have driven every trace of nausea out of her, and gradually her heartbeat began to return to normal. She took 3 cautious steps forward to the balcony railing, where the tip of a swaying green tree branch was in reach. She put her hand out hesitantly, felt the smooth vegetable texture of a leaf, grasped it, pulled it away. She moved back to the door and examined the leaf. It was a quite real leaf. Thin sap formed a bead of amber moisture at the break in the stalk as she looked at it. No illusion structure could be elaborated to that extent. So, she just had her first dive hallucination, and it had been a dilly. Trigger dropped the leaf, pushed shakily at the balcony door, and stepped back through the black light screen into the reassuring murmur of human voices in the gambling room. An hour later, the ship's loudspeaker system went on. It announced that the Dawn City would surface in 15 minutes because of gravitic disturbances, and proceed the rest of the way to Eveli in normal space, arriving approximately 5 hours behind schedule. Rest cubicle passengers would not be disturbed, unless this was specifically requested by a qualified associate. Trigger turned her attention back to her viewer, feeling rather relieved. She hadn't experienced any further hallucinations or other indications of subspace distress, but the one she'd had would do her for a while. The little viewer library she was in was otherwise deserted, and she'd been going about her studies there just the least bit nervously. Subject of the studies were the hub's principal games of chance. She'd identified a few of those she'd been watching, and one of them did look as if someone who went at it with an intelligent understanding of the odds. A part of Trigger kept tut-tutting and shaking its head at such reckless notions, but another part pointed out that they couldn't be much worse off financially than they were right now. So what if they arrived in Manon dead broke instead of practically? Besides, there was the problem of remaining inconspicuous till they got there. On the Dawn City, no one whose wardrobe was limited to one automatic sales dress was going to remain inconspicuous very long. Trigger in toto went on calculating the odds for various possible play combinations. She developed her first betting system, presently discovered several holes in it, and began to develop another. The loudspeaker system went on again. She was too absorbed to pay much attention to it at first. Then she suddenly straightened up and listened, frowning. The man speaking now was the liner's first security officer. He was being very polite and regretful. Under section such-and-such, number so-and-so, of the Federation's legal code, a cabin-by-cabin search of the passenger area of the Dawn City had become necessary. The persons of passengers would not be searched. Passengers might, if they wished, be present while their cabins were inspected, but this was not required. Baggage need not be opened, providing its spy-proofing was not activated. Any information revealed by the search which did not pertain to a violation of the code section and number in question would not be recorded and could not be introduced as future legal evidence under any circumstances. Complaints regarding the search could be addressed to any planetary moderator's office. This wasn't good at all. Trigger stood up. The absence of luggage in her cabin mightn't arouse more than passing interest in the searchers. Her gun was a different matter. Discreet inquiries regarding a female passenger who carried a double-barreled sporting Denton might be one of the check methods used by the Scout intelligence boys if they started thinking of liners which recently had left McCadden in connection with Trigger's disappearance. There weren't likely to be more than 2 or 3 guns of that type on board, and it was almost certain that she would be the only woman who owned one. She'd better go get the Denton immediately, and then vanish again into the public sections of the ship. Some security officer with a good memory and a habit of noticing faces might identify her otherwise from the news viewer pictures taken on Manon. And he just might start wondering then why she was traveling as Berna Drelganath, and start to check. She paused long enough to get the legal code article referred to into the viewer. Somebody on board appeared to have gotten himself murdered. She reached the cabin too late. A couple of young security men already were going over it. Trigger said hello pleasantly. It was too bad, but it wasn't their fault. They just had a job to do. They smiled back at her, apologized for the intrusion, and went on with their business. She sat down and watched them. The Denton was there in plain sight. Dropping it into her purse now would be more likely to fix it in their memory than leaving it where it was. The gadgets they were using were in concealing casings, and she couldn't guess what they were looking for by the way they used them. It didn't seem that either of them was trying to haul up an identifying memory about her. They did look a little surprised when the second cabin closet was opened and found to be as empty as the first, but no comments were made about that. 2 minutes after Trigger had come in, they were finished and bowed themselves out of the cabin again. They turned then toward the cabin occupied by the ancient retainers of the Ascab of Elfkund. Trigger left her door open. This she wanted to hear if she could. She heard. The Elfkund door also stayed open, while the racket beyond it grew shriller by the moment. Finally, a comweb chimed. A feminine voice spoke sternly. The quavering outcries subsided. It looked as if security had been obliged to call on someone higher up in the Elfkund entourage to come to its aid. Trigger closed her door, grinning. On the screen of her secluded library, she presently watched a great port shuttle swing in from Ivali to meet the hovering Dawn City. It would bring another 500 or so passengers on board and take off the few who had merely been making the short run from Macadon to Ivali in style. Solidopic operators were quite likely to be on the shuttle, so she had decided to keep away from the entry area. The transfer operation was carried out very expeditiously, probably to make up for some of the time lost on the surface. When the shuttle shoved off, the loudspeaker announced that normal spaceflight would be maintained till after the stopover at Garth. Trigger wandered thoughtfully back to her cabin. She closed the door behind her. Then she saw the man sitting by the ComWeb cabinet. Her breath sucked in. She crouched a little, ready to wheel and bolt. "Take it easy, Trigger," Major Quillen said. He was in civilian clothes of rather dudish cut. Trigger swallowed. There was, too obviously, no place to bolt to. "How did you find me?" He shrugged. "Longer story. You're not under arrest." "I'm not?" "No," said Quillen. "When we get to Madden, the Commissioner will have a suggestion to make to you." "Suggestion?" Trigger said warily. "I believe you're to take back your old pre-call job in Manon, but as cover for your participation in our little project, if you agree to it." "What if I don't?" He shrugged again. "It seems you'll be writing your own ticket from here on out." Trigger stared at him, wondering. "Why?" Quillen grinned. "New instructions have been handed down," he said. "If you're still curious, ask what's it." "Oh," Trigger said. "Then why are you here?" "I," said Quillen, "am to make damn sure you get to Manon. I brought a few people with me." "Mehul too?" Trigger asked, a shade diffidently. "No, she's on Macadon." "Is she... how's she doing?" "Doing all right," Quillen said. "She sends her regards, and says a little less heft on the next solar plexus you torpedo should be good enough." Trigger flushed. "She isn't sore, is she?" "Not the way you mean," he considered. "Not many people have jumped Mehul successfully. In her cockeyed way, she seemed pretty proud of her student." Trigger felt the flush deepen. "I caught her off guard," she said. "Obviously," said Quillen. "In any ordinary argument, she could pull your legs off and tie you up with them. Still, that wasn't bad." "Have you talked to anybody since you came on board?" "Just the room stewardess, and a couple of old ladies in the next cabin." "Yeah," he said. "Couple of old ladies. What did you talk about?" Trigger recounted the conversation. He reflected, nodded, and stood up. "I've put a couple of suitcases in that closet over there," he said. "Your personal stuff is in them, detracered. Another thing. Somebody checked over your finances and came to the conclusion you're broke." "Not exactly broke," said Trigger. Quillen reached into a pocket, pulled out an envelope, and laid it on the cabinet. "Here's a little extra spending money then," he said. "The balance of your pre-call pay to date. I had it picked up on Ivali this morning. 728 FC." "Thanks," Trigger said. "I can use some of that." They stood looking at each other. "Any questions?" he asked. "Sure," Trigger said, "but you wouldn't answer them." "Try me, doll," said Quillen. "But let's shift operations to the fanciest cocktail lounge on this thing before you start. I feel like relaxing a little. For just one girl, you've given us a fairly rough time these last 48 hours." "I'm sorry," Trigger said. "I'll bet," said Quillen. Trigger glanced at the closet. If he'd brought everything along, there was a dress in one of those suitcases that would have been a little too daring for Macadon. It should, therefore, be just about right for a cocktail lounge on the Dawn City, and she hadn't had a chance to wear it yet. "Give me 10 minutes to change." "Fine." Quillen started toward the door. "By the way, I'm your neighbor now." "The cabin at the end of the hall?" she asked, startled. "That's right." He smiled at her. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. Well, that was going to be cozy. Trigger found the dress, shook it out, and slipped into it, enormously puzzled, but also enormously relieved. That what's-it. Freshening up her makeup, she wondered how he had induced the Elfcon ladies to leave. Perhaps he managed to have a better cabin offered to them. It must be convenient to have that kind of a pull. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy, Chapter 12. "Well, we didn't just leave it up to them," Quillen said. "Ship's engineering spotted a radiation leak in their cabin. Slight, but definite. They got bundled out in a squawking hurry." He added, "They did get a better cabin, though." "Might have been less trouble to get me to move," Trigger remarked. "Might have been. I didn't know what mood you'd be in." Trigger decided to let that ride. This cocktail lounge was a very curious place. By the looks of it, there were 30 or 40 people in their immediate vicinity. But if one looked again in a couple of minutes, there might be an entirely different 30 or 40 people around. Sitting in easy chairs or at tables, standing about in small groups, talking, drinking, laughing, they drifted past slowly. Overhead, below, sometimes tilted at odd angles, fading from sight and presently returning. In actual fact, she and Quillen were in a little room by themselves, and with more than ordinary privacy via an audio block and a reconstruct scrambler which Quillen had switched on at their entry. "I'll leave us out of the viewer circuit," he remarked, "until you've finished your questions." "Viewer circuit?" she repeated. Quillen waved a hand around. "That," he said. "There are more commercial and industrial spies, political agents, top-class confidence men, and whatnot on board this ship than you'd probably believe. A good percentage of them are pretty fair lip-readers, and the things you want to talk about are connected with the Federation's hottest current secret. So while it's a downright crime not to put you on immediate display in a place like this, we won't take the chance." Trigger let that ride too. A group had materialized at an oblong table 8 feet away while Quillen was speaking. Everybody at the table seemed fairly high, and 2 of the couples were embarrassingly amorous, but she couldn't quite picture any of them as somebody's spies or agents. She listened to the muted chatter. Some hub dialect she didn't know. "None of those people can see or hear us then?" she asked. "Not until we want them to. Viewer gives you as much privacy as you like. Most of the crowd here just doesn't see much point to privacy. Like those 2. Trigger followed his glance. At a tilted angle above them, a matched pair of black-haired, black-gowned young sirens sat at a small table, sipping their drinks, looking languidly around. "Twins," Trigger said. "No," said Quillen. "That's Blent and Company." "Oh?" "Blent's a lady of leisure and somewhat excessively narcissistic tendencies," he explained. He gave the matched pair another brief study. "Perhaps one can't really blame her. One of them's her facsimile. Blent, whichever it is never without her face." "Oh," Trigger said. She'd been studying the gowns. "That," she said a trifle enviously, "is why I'm not at all eager to go on display here." "Eh?" said Quillen. Trigger turned to regard herself in the wall mirror on the right, which, she had noticed, remained carefully unobscured by drifting viewers and viewees. A thoughtful touch on the lounge management's part. "Until we walked in here," she explained, "I thought this was a pretty sharp little outfit I'm wearing." Quillen said judiciously. He made a detailed appraisal of the mirror image of the slim, green, backless, half-thigh-length sheath which had looked so breathtaking and seductive in a SACI display window. Trigger's eyes narrowed a little. The Major had appraised the dress in detail before. "It's about as sharp a little outfit you could get for around 150 credits," he remarked. "Most of the items the girls are sporting here are personality conceptions. That starts at around 10 to 20 times as high. I wasn't talking about displaying the dress. Now, what were those questions?" Trigger took a small sip of her drink, considering. She hadn't made up her mind about Major Quillen, but until she could evaluate him more definitely, it might be best to go by appearances. The appearances so far indicated small sips in his company. "How did you people find me so quickly?" she asked. "Next time you want to sneak off a civilized planet," Quillen advised her, "pick something like a small freighter, or hire a small boat to get you out of the system and flag down a freighter for you. Plenty of tramp captains will make a space stop to pick up a paying passenger. Liners we can check." "Sorry," Trigger said meekly. "I'm still new at this business." "And thank God for that," said Quillen. "If you had the time and the money, it's also a good idea, of course, to zig a few times before you zag towards where you're really heading. Actually, I suppose, the credit for picking you up so fast should go to those collating computers." "Oh?" "Yes." Major Quillen looked broodingly at his drink for a moment. "There they sit," he remarked suddenly, "with their stupid plastic faces hanging out. Rows of them. You feed them something you don't understand. They don't understand it either. Nobody can tell me they can. But they kick it around and giggle a bit, and out comes some ungodly suggestion." "So they helped you find me?" she said cautiously. It was clear that the Major had strong feelings about computers. "Oh, sure," he said. "It usually turns out it was a good idea to do what those CCs say. Anything unusual that shows up in the area you're working on gets chunked into the things as a matter of course. We were on the liners. Dawn City reports back a couple of murders. Dawn City to the head of the list, cry the computers. Nobody asks why. They just plow into the ticket purchase records. And right there are the little RG thumbprints." He looked at Trigger. "My own bet," he said somewhat accusingly, "was that you were one of those that had just taken off. We didn't know about that ticket reservation." "What I don't see," Trigger said, changing the subject, "is why 2 murders should seem so very unusual. There must be quite a few of them after all." "True," said Quillen, "but not murders that look like Catassin killings." "Oh," she said, startled. "Is that what these were?" "That's what ship security thinks." Trigger frowned. "But what could be the connection?" Quillen reached across the table and patted her hand. "You've got it," he said with approval. "Exactly. No connection. Some day I'm going to walk down those rows and give each of them a blast where it will do the most good. It will be worth being broken for." Trigger said, "I thought that Catassin planet was being guarded." "It is. It would be very hard to sneak one out nowadays, but somebody's breeding them in the hub. Just a few. Keeps the price up." Trigger grimaced uncomfortably. She'd seen recordings of those swift, clever, constitutionally murderous creatures in action. "You say it looked like Catassin killings. They haven't found it?" "No, but they think they got rid of it. Emptied the air from most of the ship after they surfaced and combed over the rest of it with life detectors. They've got a detector system set up now that would spot a Catassin if it moved 20 feet in any direction." "Life detectors go haywire out of normal space, don't they?" she said. "That's why they surfaced then." Quillen nodded. "You're a well-informed doll. They're pretty certain it's been sucked into space or disposed of by its owner, but they'll go on looking till we dive beyond Garth." "Who got killed?" "A rest warden and a security officer. In the rest cubicle area. It might have been sent after somebody there. Apparently, it ran into the two men and killed them on the spot. The officer got off one shot, and that set off the automatic alarms. So Pussycat couldn't finish the job that time. "It's all sort of gruesome, isn't it?" Trigger said. "Catassins are," Quillen agreed. "That's a fact." Trigger took another sip. She set down her glass. "There's something else," she said reluctantly. "Yes?" "When you said you'd come on board to see I got to Manon, I was thinking none of the people who've been after me on McCadden could know I was on the Dawn City. They might, though, quite easily." "Oh?" said Quillen. "Yes. You see, I made 2 calls to the ticket office, one from a street comweb and one from the bank. If they already had spotted me by that tracer material, they could have had an audio pickup on me, I suppose." "I think we'd better suppose it," said Quillen. "You had a tail when you came out of the bank, anyway." His glance went past her. "We'll get back to that later. Right now, take a look at that entrance, will you?" Trigger turned in the direction he'd indicated. "They do look like they're somebody important," she said. "Do you know them?" "Some of them. That gentleman who looks like he almost has to be the Dawn City's first captain really is the Dawn City's first captain. The ladies he's escorting into the lounge is Lyad Ermitine. The Ermitine. You've heard of the Ermitines." "The Ermitine Wars? Trinest?" Trigger said doubtfully. "They're the ones. Lyad is the current head of the clan." The history of hub systems other than one's own became so involved so rapidly that its detailed study was engaged in only by specialists. Trigger wasn't one. "Trinest is one of the restricted planets now, isn't it?" she ventured. "It is. Restriction is supposed to be a handicap, but Trinest is also one of the wealthiest individual worlds in the hub." Trigger watched the woman with some interest as the party moved along in a dim corridor, followed by the viewer circuit's invisible pickup. Lyad Ermitine didn't look more than a few years older than she was herself. Rather small, slender, with delicately pretty features. She wore something ankle-length and long-sleeved in lusterless gray with an odd, smoky quality to it. "Isn't she the Empress of Trinest or something of the sort?" Trigger asked. Quillen shook his head. "They've had no emperors there, technically, since they had to sign their treaty with the Federation. She just owns the planet, that's all." "What would she be doing going to Manon?" "I'd like to know," Quillen said. "The Ermitine's a lady of many interests. Now, see the plump elderly man just behind her? The ugly one with the big head who sort of keeps blinking? That one. He's Belchik Pluli. And—" "Pluli?" Trigger interrupted. "The Pluli lines?" "Yes. Why?" "Oh, nothing really. I heard... a friend of mine... Pluli's got a yacht out in the Manon system. And a daughter." Quillen nodded. "Neelok." "How do you know?" "I've met her. Quite a girl, that Neelok. Only child of Pluli's old age, and he dotes on her. Anyway, he's been on the verge of being blacklisted by Grand Commerce off and on through the past 3 decades. But nobody's ever been able to pin anything more culpable on him than that he keeps skimming extremely close to the limits of a large number of laws." "He's very rich, I imagine?" Trigger said thoughtfully. "Very. He'd be much richer even if it weren't for his hobby." "What's that?" "Harems. The Pluli harems rate among the most intriguing and best educated in the hub." Trigger looked at Pluli again. "Ugh," she said faintly. Quillen laughed. "The Pluli salaries are correspondingly high. Viewers dropping the group now, so there's just one more I'd like you to notice. The tall girl with black hair in orange." Trigger nodded. "Yes, I see her. She's beautiful." "So she is. She's also Space Scout Intelligence. Gaia. Comes from Farnhart, where they use the single name system. A noted horsewoman, very wealthy, socially established. Which is why we like to use her in situations like this." Trigger was silent a moment. Then she said, "What kind of situation is it? I mean, what's she doing with Lyad Ermitine and the others?" "She's probably attached herself to the group as soon as she discovered Lyad had come on board, which," Quillen said, "is exactly what I would have told Gaia to do if I'd spotted Lyad first." Trigger was silent a little longer this time. "Were you thinking this Lyad could be one of our suspects?" "Well," said Quillen judiciously, "let's say Lyad has all the basic qualifications. Since she's come on board, we'd better consider her. When something's going on that looks more than usually tricky, Lyad is always worth considering. And there's one point that looks even more interesting to me now than it did at first." "What's that?" "Those two little old ladies I eased out of their rightful cabin." Trigger looked at him. "What about them?" "This about them. The Ascab of Elfgund is, you might say, one of the branch managers of the Ermitine interests in the hub. He is also a hard-working heel in his own right. But he's not the right size to be one of the people we're thinking about. Lyad is. He might have been doing a job for her." "Job?" she asked. She laughed. "Not with those odd little grannies." "We know the odd little grannies. They're the Ascab's poisoners, and pretty slick at it." "They were sizing you up while you were having that little chat, doll. Probably not for a coffin this time. You were just getting the equivalent of a pretty thorough medical checkup. Presumably, though, for some sinister ultimate purpose." "How do you know?" Trigger asked, very uncomfortably. "One of those little suitcases in their cabin was a diagnostic recorder. It would have been standing fairly close to the door while you were there. If they didn't take your recordings out before I got there, they're still inside. They're being watched, and they know it. It seemed like a good idea to keep the Ascab feeling fairly nervous until we found out whether those sweethearts of his had been parked next door to you on purpose." "Apparently they were," Trigger admitted. "Nice bunch of people." "Oh, they're not all bad. Lyad has her points. And old Belchik, for example, isn't really a heel. He just had no ethics. Or morals. And revolting habits. Anyway, all this brings up the matter of what we should do with you now." Trigger set her glass down on the table. "Refill?" Quillen inquired. He reached for the iced crystal pitcher between them. "No," she said. "I just want to make a statement." "State away." He refilled his own glass. "For some reason," said Trigger, "I've been acting lately, the last 2 days, in a remarkably stupid manner." Quillen choked. He set his glass down hastily, reached over and patted her hand. "Doll," he said, touched, "it's come to you, at last." She scowled at him. "I don't usually act that way." "That," said Quillen, "was what had me so baffled. According to the Commissioner and others, you're as bright in the head as a diamond usually. And frankly—" "I know it," Trigger said dangerously. "Don't rub it in." "I apologize," said Quillen. He patted her other hand. "At any rate," Trigger said, drawing her hands back, "now that I've realized it, I'm going to make up for it. From here on out, I'll cooperate." "To the hilt?" She nodded. "To the hilt. Whatever that is." "You can't imagine," said Quillen, "how much that relieves me." He refilled her glass, giving her a relieved look. "I had definite instructions, of course, not to do anything like grabbing you by the back of the neck, flinging you into a rest cubicle and sitting on it, guns drawn until we berthed in pre-call port. But I was tempted, I can tell you." He paused and thought. "You know," he began again, "that really would be the best." "No," Trigger said indignantly. "When I said cooperate, I meant actively. Mihul said I'm considered one of the gang in this project. From now on, I'll behave like one. And I'll also expect to be treated like one." Said Quillen. "Well, There is something you can do, all right. What's that? Go on display here, now. What for? She asked. As bait, you sweet ninny. If the boss grabber is on this ship, we should draw a new nibble from him. He appraised the green dress in the mirror again. His expression grew absent. It might be best, Trigger suspected, a trifle uneasily, to keep Major Quillen's thoughts turned away from things like nibbling. "All right," she said briskly. "Let's do that. But you'll have to brief me." End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy, Chapter 13. She had felt somewhat self-conscious for the first 2 or 3 minutes, but it helped when she caught a glimpse of their own table drifting by among the others and realized that the smiling redhead viewer image over there looked completely at her ease. It helped, too, that Major Quillen turned suddenly into the light but ardent conversation type of companion. In the short preceding briefing, he had pointed out that a bit of flirting, etc., was a necessary, or at least nearly necessary, part of the act. Trigger was going along with the flirting. He could be right about that. She intended to stay on the alert for the etc. They got nibbles very promptly, but not quite the right kind. The concealed table comweb murmured, "A caller requests to be connected with Major Quillen. Is it permitted?" "Oh ho," Quillen said poisonously. "I suspected we should have stayed off circuit. Who's the caller?" "The name given is Keth DeBall." Quillen laughed. "Give the little wolf Major Quillen's regards and tell him it was a good try. I'll look him up tomorrow." He gave Trigger a gentle wink. "Let 'em pant," he said, "at a distance." She smiled uncertainly. If he had a mustache, she thought, he'd be twirling it. There were 2 more calls in the next few minutes of similar nature. Quillen rebuffed them cheerfully. It was rather flattering in a way. She wondered how so many people in the cocktail lounge happened to know Quillen by name. When the comweb reported the 4th caller, it sounded odd. "The name given is the Lady Lyad Ermitine," it said. Quillen beamed. "Lyad? Bless her heart. A pleasure. Put her through." A screen shaped itself on the wall mirror to the right. Lyad Ermitine's face appeared in it. "Heslet Quillen," she smiled. "So you aren't permanently lost to your friends after all." It was a light, liquid voice. It suited her appearance perfectly. "Only to the frivolous ones," Quillen said. His thick black brows went up. His face took on a dedicated look. "I'm headed for Manon on duty." She nodded. "Still with the subspace engineers?" "And with the rank of major by now," Quillen said. "Congratulations. But I'd already observed that your fabulous good fortune hasn't deserted you in the least." Lyad's glance switched to Trigger. She smiled again. It was a pleasant, easy smile that showed white teeth. "Would you shield your comweb, Quillen?" "Shield it?" Quillen looked surprised. "Why, certainly." He reached under the edge of the table. The drifting viewer images vanished. "Go ahead." Lyad's eyes turned back to Trigger. They were off-color eyes, like amber or a light wine, fringed with long black lashes. Very steady, very knowing eyes. Trigger felt herself tensing. "Forgive me the discourtesy of inquiring directly," the light voice said. "But you are Trigger Argy, aren't you?" Quillen's hand slapped the table. He looked at Trigger and laughed. "Better give it up, Trigger. I told you you were much more widely known than you believed." "Well, Brule," Trigger muttered moodily to the solidopic propped upright against the pillow before her, "you'd bug those pretty blue eyes out if you knew who's invited me to dinner." Brule smiled back winningly. She lay on her cabin's bed, chin on her crossed arms, eyes a dozen inches from the pretty blue ones. She studied Brule's features soberly. "Major Heslett Quillen," she announced suddenly in cold, even tones, "is a completely impossible character." It was no more than the truth. She didn't mind so much that Quillen wouldn't tell her what he thought of Lyad Emertine's standing on the suspect list now. There hadn't really been much opportunity for open conversation so far, but he and that unpleasant Belchik Pluli had engaged in some jovial backslapping and rib-punching when he and Trigger went over to join Lyad's party at her request. And Quillen cried out merrily that he and Belchik had long had one great interest in common, ha ha ha. Then those two great buddies vanished together for a full hour to take in some very special, not publicly programmed Sensations Unlimited in the Dawn City's inferno. Lyad had smiled after them as they left. "Aren't men disgusting?" she said tolerantly. That reflected on her, didn't it? She was supposed to be very good friends with somebody like that. Of course, Quillen must have some bit of intelligence business in mind with Pluli, but there should be other ways of going about it. And later, when she'd been just a little stiff with him, Quillen had had the nerve to tell her not to be a prude, doll. Trigger shoved the solidopic under the pillow. Then she rolled on her side and blinked at the wall. Naturally, Major Quillen's personal habits were none of her business. It was just that, in less than an hour, he was to pick her up and take her to the Ermitine suite for that dinner. She was wondering how she should behave towards him. Reasonably pleasant, but cool, she decided. But again, not too cool, since she'd obligated herself to help him find out what the Tranest Tycooness was after. Any obvious lack of friendliness between them might make the job more difficult. Trigger sighed. Things were getting complicated again. While Quillen was indulging his baser nature among the questionable attractions of the Inferno, she'd shot 300 of her pre-call credits on a formal black gown, on what yesterday she would have considered a rather unbelievable gown. Even at an Ermitine dinner, she couldn't actually look dowdy in it. And then, accompanied by Gaia, who had turned out to be a very pleasant but not very communicative companion, she'd headed for a gambling room to make back the price of the gown. It hadn't worked out. The game she particularly studied up on turned out to have a 500 minimum play, which finished that scheme. The system she'd planned to use looked very sound, but she needed more than one chance to try it in. She and Gaia sat down at another table with a different game, where you could get in for 50 credits. In 8 minutes, Trigger lost 120 and quit. Gaia won 75. It had been an interesting day, but with some unsatisfactory aspects to it. She hauled the solidopic out from under the pillow again. "And you," she told Brule warningly, "seem to be playing around with some very bad company, my friend. Just luck I'm coming back to see you don't get into serious trouble." She'd showered and was studying the black gown's effect before the mirror when the ComWeb chimed. "Permission for audio intrusion granted," Trigger said casually, without looking around. She was getting used to this sort of thing. "Thank you, Miss Drelganeth," said the ComWeb. "A package from the Belden shop has been deposited in your mail transmitter." It signed off. Belden shop? Trigger frowned, laid the gown across a chair, and went over to the transmitter receptacle. She opened it. A flat small green package marked "The Styles of Belden" slid out. A delicate scent came trailing along with it. A small white envelope clung to the package's top. Inside the envelope was a card. It read, "A peace offering. Would you wear it to dinner in token of forgiveness? Very humbly, Q." Trigger found herself smiling and wiped off the smile. Then she let it come back. No point in staying grim with the character. She pulled the package tab and opened it up. There were 3 smaller packages inside. She opened the first of these and for a moment gazed doubtfully at 4 objects like green leaf buds, each the size of her thumb. She laid them down and opened the second package. This one contained a pair of very fancy high heels, green and pale gold. Out of the third flowed something which was, at all events, extraordinarily beautiful material of some kind. Velvety green, shimmeringly alive. Its touch was a caress. Its perfume was like soft whispers. Lifting one end with great care between thumb and finger, Trigger let it unfold itself to the floor. Tilting her head to one side, she studied the shimmering featherweight cat's cradle of jewel-green ribbons that hung there. Wear it? What was it? She reflected, found her dressing gown in one of the suitcases, slipped it on, sat down before the ComWeb with the mysterious ribbon arrangement, and dialed Gaia's number. The intelligence girl was in her cabin and obviously had been napping, but she was wide awake now. "Shielded here," she said quickly as soon as her image cleared. "Go ahead." "It's nothing important," Trigger said hastily. Gaia relaxed. "It's just—" She held up the ribbons. "Major Quillen sent me this." Gaia uttered a small squeal. "Oh, beautiful! A Belden!" "That's what it says." Gaia smiled. "He must like you." "Oh?" said Trigger. She hesitated. Gaia's face grew questioning. She asked, "Is something the matter?" "Probably not," said Trigger. She considered. "If you laugh," she warned, "I'll hate you." She indicated the ribbons again. "What is that Belden really?" Gaia blinked. "You haven't been around our decadent circles long enough," she said soberly. Then she did laugh. "Don't hate me, Trigger. Anyway, it's very high fashion. It's also," her glance went quickly over Trigger, "in excellent taste in this case. It's a Belden gown." A gown. Some of the beautiful ribbons were wider than others. None of them looked as wide as they should have been. Not for a gown. Dubiously, Trigger wriggled and fitted herself into the high-fashion item. Even before she went over to the mirror in it, she knew it wouldn't do. Not possibly. Styles on many hub worlds were rather bold, of course, but she was sure this effect wasn't what the Belden's designers had intended. She stepped in front of the mirror. Her eyes widened. "Brother," she breathed. That Belden did go with a woman like Stripes went with a tiger. After one look, you couldn't quite understand why nature hadn't arranged for it first. But just as obviously, there wasn't nearly enough Belden around at the moment. Trigger checked the time and began to feel harried. Probably she'd wind up wearing the black gown anyway, but at least she wanted to get this matter worked out before she decided. She dialed for a drink, took 2 swallows, and reflected that she might have put the thing on backwards, or upside down. 5 minutes later, she sat at the dresser, tapping her fingers on its glassy surface, gazing at the small pile of green ribbons before her and whistling softly. There was a thoroughly bared look on her face. Suddenly, she stood up and went back to the ComWeb. "Ribbons?" said the lady who was the Belden shop's manager. "That would be 741. A delightful little creation." "Delightful," said Trigger. "May I see it on the model?" "Immediately, madam." A few moments later, a long-limbed model strolled into the view screen, displaying an exquisite arrangement of burnt sienna ribbons plus 4 largest leaf-like designs. Trigger glanced quickly back to the table where she had put down the strange green buds. They had quietly opened out meanwhile. She thanked the manager, switched off the ComWeb, got into the Belden again, and attached her leaf designs where the model had carried them. They adhered softly, molding themselves to her, neatly completing the costume. She stepped into the high heels and looked in the mirror again. She breathed, "Brother," again. McCadden wouldn't have approved. She wasn't sure she approved either. But one thing was certain, there wasn't the remotest suggestion of dowdiness about a Belden. Objectively, impersonally considered, the effect was terrific. Feeling tawny and feline, Trigger slowly lifted one shoulder and lowered it again. She turned and strolled toward the full-length mirror across the cabin, admiring the shifts of the Belden effect in the flow of motion. Terrific. With another drink, she could do it. She dialed another drink and settled down with it beneath the mechanical stylist for a readjustment in the hairdo department. This time, the stylist purred as it surveyed and hummed while it worked. And when the hairdo was done and Trigger moved to get up, its flexible little tool pads pulled her back gently into the seat and tilted up her chin. For a moment, she was startled. Then she saw that the stylist had produced a shiny makeup kit and was opening it. This time, she was getting the works. 20 minutes later, Quillen's voice informed her via the ComWeb that he could be outside her cabin anytime she was ready. Trigger told him cheerily to come right over, picked up her purse, and swaggered toward the door, smiling a cool, feline smile. "Prude, eh?" she muttered. She opened the door. "Yarg!" cried Quillen, shaken. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy, Chapter 14. They were out on a terrace near the top of an illusion mountainside in a beautiful evening. Dinner had been old-style and delicious, served by its creators, two slim, brown-skinned, red-lipped girls who looked much too young to have acquired such skills. They were natives of Trinest, Lyad said proudly, and two of the finest food technicians in the hub. They were, at all events, the two finest food technicians Trigger had run into as yet. The brandy which followed the dinner seemed to represent no letdown to the connoisseurs around Trigger. She went at it cautiously, though she had swallowed a couple of wake-up capsules just before they walked into the Ermitagne suite. The capsules took effect in the middle of the first course, and what she woke up to was a disconcerting awareness of being the center of much careful attention. The boys were all giving her plus Belden the eye intensively. Even Lyad's giant-sized butler, or major domo, or whatever she called him, named Varad, ogled coldly out of the background. Trigger gave them the eye back one after the other in turn, and that stopped it. Lyad, beautifully wearing something which would have passed muster at the U-League's annual presidential dinner in Sacy, looked amused. It wasn't till the end of the second course that Trigger began to feel at ease again. After that she forgot, more or less, about the Belden. The talk remained light during dinner. When they switched off the illusion background for a look at the goings-on during the Garth stopover, she took the occasion to study her companions in more detail. There were 3 men at the table, Lyad and herself. Quillen sat opposite her. Belchik Pluly's unseemly person, in a black silk robe which left his plump arms bare from the elbows down, was on Quillen's right. The third man fascinated her. It was as if some strange cold creature had walked up out of a polar sea to come on board their ship. It wasn't so much his appearance, though the green tip of a Vethi sponge lying coiled lightly about his neck probably had something to do with the impression. Trigger knew about Vethi sponges and their addicts, though she hadn't seen either before. It wasn't so serious an addiction, except perhaps in the fact that it was rarely given up again. The sponges soothed jangled nerves, stabilized unstable emotions. Balmorden didn't look like a man who needed one. He was big, not as tall as Quillen, but probably heavier, with strong features, a boldly jutting nose, bleak, pale eyes. He was about 50, and wore a richly ornamented blue shirt and trousers. The shirt hung loose, perhaps to conceal the flattened contours of his odd companion's body. Lyad had introduced him as a De Vega scientist, and in a manner which indicated he was a man of considerable importance. That meant he was almost certainly a member of the De Vega's hierarchy, which in itself would have made him very interesting. Trigger had run into some of the oddball missionaries the De Vegas kept sending about the hub, and she'd sometimes speculated curiously regarding the leaders of that chronically angry, unpredictable nation, which, on its 28 restricted worlds, formed more than 6% of the population of the hub. The De Vegas seemed to like nobody, and certainly nobody liked them. Balmorden didn't fit her picture of a De Vegas leader too badly. His manner and talk were easygoing and agreeable, but his particular brand of ogle, when she first became aware of it, had been disquieting. Rather like a biologist planning the details of an interesting vivisection. Of course, he was a biologist. But Trigger kept wondering why Lyad had invited him to dinner. She was positive, for one thing, that Belchik Pluli wasn't at all happy about Balmorden's presence. Dinner was over before the Garth takeoff, and they switched themselves back to the mountainside and took other chairs. A red-haired, green-eyed, tanned, sinuous young woman named Flam appeared from time to time to renew brandy glasses and pass iced fruits around. She gave Trigger coolly speculative looks now and then. Then Varad showed up again with a flat tray of what turned out to be a very special brand of tobacco. Trigger declined. The men made connoisseur-type sounds of high appreciation, and everybody, including Lyad, lit up small pipes of a very special brand of coral and puffed away happily. Quillen looked up at Varad. "Hi, big boy," he said pleasantly. "How's everything been with you?" Varad, in a wide-sleeved scarlet jacket and creased black trousers, bowed his shaved bullet head very slightly. "Everything's been fine, Major Quillen," he said. "Thank you." He turned and went out of the place. Trigger glanced after him. Varad awed her a little. He was really huge. Moving about among them, he had seemed like a softly padding elephant. And there was an elephant-steady deftness in the way he held out the tiny tobacco trays. The Ermitine winked at Quillen. "Quillen wrestled Varad to a pin-down once," she said to Trigger. "A 57-minute round, wasn't it?" "Thereabouts," Quillen said. He added, "Trigger doesn't know yet that I was a sports bum in my youth." "Really?" Trigger said. He nodded. "Come from a long line of sports bums, as a matter of fact. But I broke tradition. Went into business for myself, finally. Nowadays, I'm old and soft. Eh, Belchy?" The two great pals, sitting side by side, dug elbows at each other and ha-ha-ha'd. Trigger winced. "Still in the same line of business on the side?" Lyad inquired. Quillen looked steadily at her and grinned. "More or less," he said. "We might," Lyad said thoughtfully, "come back to that later. As for that match with Varad," she went on to Trigger, "it was really a terrific event. Varad was a Trinest arena professional before I took him into my personal employ, and he's very, very rarely been beaten in any such contest." She laughed. "And before such a large group of people, too. I'm afraid he's never quite forgiven you for that, Quillen." "I'll keep out of his way," Quillen said easily. "Did you people know," Lyad said, "that the trouble on the way between McCadden and Aveli was caused by a Catassin killing?" There was a touch of mischief in the question, Trigger thought. There were assorted, startled responses. The Ermitine went briefly over some of the details Quillen had told. Essentially, it was the same story. "And do you know, Belchik, what the creature was trying to do? It was trying to get into the rest cubicle vaults. Just think, it might have been sent after you." It was rather cruel. Pluly's head jerked, and he blinked rapidly at Lyad, saying nothing. He was a badly scared little man at that moment. Trigger felt a little sorry for him, but not too sorry. Belchy's ogle had been of the straightforward, loose-lipped, drooling variety. "You're safe when you're in one of those things, Belchik," Quillen said reassuringly. "Wouldn't you feel a little safer there yourself, Lyad? If you say they're not even sure they've killed the creature, "I probably shall have a cubicle set up here," Lyad said, "but not as protection against a catassin. It would never get past Pili, for one thing." She looked at Trigger. "Oh, I forgot. You haven't met Pili. Varad," she called. Varad appeared at the far end of the terrace. "Yes, First Lady?" "Bring in Pili," she told him. Varad bowed. "Pili is in the room, First Lady." He glanced about, went over to a massive easy-chair a few feet away, and swung it aside. Something like a huge ball of golden fur behind it moved and sat up. It was an animal of some sort. Its head seemed turned toward the group, but whatever features it had remained hidden under the fur. Then an arm like the arm of a bear reached out, and Trigger saw a great furred hand that in shape seemed completely human clutch the chair's edge. "He was resting," Lyad said. "Not sleeping. Pili doesn't sleep. He's a perfect guardian. Come here, Pili. Meet Trigger Argee." Pili swung up on his feet. It was an impressively effortless motion. There was a thick, wide torso on short, thick legs under the golden fur. The structure was gorilla-like. Pili might weigh around 400 pounds. He started silently forward, and Trigger felt a tingle of alarm. But he stopped 6 feet away. She looked at him. "Do I say something to Pili?" Lyad looked pleased. "No, he's a biostructure. A very intelligent one, but speech isn't included in his pattern." Trigger kept looking at the golden-furred nightmare. "How can he see to guard you through all that hair?" "He doesn't see," Lyad said. "At least, not as we do. Pili's part of one of our Trinest experiments. The original stock came from the Macadon life banks, a small, golden-haired Earth monkey. The present level of the experiment is on the fancy side. It has 4 hearts, for example, and what amounts to a second brain at the lower half of its spine. But it doesn't come equipped with visual organs. Pili is one of 23 of the type. They have compensatory perception of a kind that is still quite mysterious. We hope to breed them past the speech barrier, so they can tell us what they do instead of seeing. All right, Pili, run along." She said to Belmorden, "I believe he doesn't like that Vethi thing of yours very much." Belmorden nodded. "I had the same impression." Perhaps, Trigger thought, that was why Pili had been lurking so close to them. She watched the biostructure move off down the terrace, grotesque and huge. She had got its scent as it went past her, a fresh, rather pleasant whiff, like the smell of ripe apples. An almost amiable sort of nightmare figure Pili was. The apple smell went with that, seemed to fit in. But nightmare was there too. She found herself feeling rather sorry for Pili. "In a way," Lyad said, "Pili brings to us that matter of business I mentioned this afternoon." The group's eyes shifted over to her. She smiled. "We have good scientists on Trinest," she said, "as Pili, I think, demonstrates." She nodded at Belmorden. "There are good scientists in the De Vegas Union, and everyone here is aware that the treaties of restriction imposed on both our governments have made it impossible for our citizens to engage seriously in plasmoid research." Trigger nodded briefly as the light amber eyes paused on her for a moment. Quillen had cautioned her not to show surprise at anything the Ermitine might say or do. If Trigger didn't know what to say herself, she was merely to look inscrutable. "I'll scrut," he explained. "The others won't. I'll take over then, and you just follow my lead. Get it?" "Belmorden," Lyad said, "I understand you are going to Manon to attend the seminars and demonstrations on the plasmoid station?" "That is true, First Lady," said Belmorden. "Now I," Lyad told the company, "shall be more honest. The information released in those seminars is of no value whatever. He," she nodded at the Dervega scientist, "and I are going to Manon with the same goal in mind. That is, to obtain plasmoids for our government laboratories." Belmorden smiled amiably. Trigger asked. "How do you intend to obtain them?" "By offering very large sums of money, or equivalent inducements, to people who are in a position to get them for me," said Lyad. Quillen tut-tutted disapprovingly. "The First Lady's mind," he told Trigger, "turns readily to illegal methods." "When necessary," Lyad said, undisturbed, "as it is here." "How about you, sir?" Quillen asked Balmordan. "Are we to understand that you also would be interested in the purchase of a middling plasmoid or two?" "I would be, naturally," Balmordan said, "but not at the risk of causing trouble for my government." "Of course not," Quillen said. He thought a moment. "You, Belchy?" he asked. Pluley looked alarmed. "No, no, no," he said hastily. He blinked wildly. "I'll stick to the shipping business. It's safer." Quillen patted him fondly on the shoulder. "That's one law-abiding citizen in this group." He winked at Trigger. "Trigger's wondering," he told Lyad, "why she and I are being told these things." "Well, obviously," Lyad said, "Trigger and you are in an excellent position, or will be very soon, to act as middlemen in the matter." "What—" Trigger began, astounded. Then, as all eyes swiveled over to her, she checked herself. "Do you really think," she asked Lyad, "that we'd agree to such a thing?" "Certainly not," said Lyad. "I don't expect anyone to agree to anything tonight. Though it's a safe assumption, I'm not the only one here who has made sure this conversation is not being recorded, and will not be available for reconstruction." "Well, Quillen?" She smiled. "How right you are, First Lady," Quillen said. He tapped a breast pocket. "Scrambler and Distorter present and in action." "And you, Balmordan?" "I must admit," Balmordan said pleasantly, "that I thought it wise to take certain precautions." "Very wise," said Lyad. Her glance shifted, with some amusement in it, to Pluley. "Belchik?" "You're a nerve-wracking woman, Lyad," Belchik said unhappily. "Yes, I'm scrambling, of course." He shuddered. "I can't afford to take chances. Not when you're around." "Of course not. And even so," said Lyad, "there are still reasons why an unconsidered word might be embarrassing in this company. So no, Trigger, I'm not expecting anybody to agree to anything tonight. I'm merely mentioning that I'm interested in the purchase of plasmoids. Incidentally, I'd be very much more interested even in seeing you and Quillen enter my employ directly. Yes, Belchik?" Pluley had begun giggling wildly. "I was having the same idea," he gasped. "About one of 'em anyway. He jerked and came to an abrupt stop, transfixed by Trigger's stare. Then he reached for his glass, blinking at top speed. "Excuse me," he muttered. "Hardly, Belchik," said Lyad. She gave Trigger a small wink. "But I can assure you, Trigger Argy, that you'd find my pay and working conditions very attractive indeed." It seemed a good moment to look inscrutable. Trigger did. "Serious about that, Lyad?" asked Quillen. The Ermitine said, "Certainly I'm serious. Both of you could be of great value to me at present." She looked at him a moment. "Did you ever happen to tell Trigger about the manner in which you re-established the family fortune?" "Not in any great detail," Quillen said. "A very good hijacker and smuggler went to waste when you signed up with the engineers," Lyad said. "But perhaps not entirely to waste." "Perhaps not," acknowledged Quillen. He grinned. "But I'm a modest man. One fortune's enough for me." "There was a time, you know," Lyad said, "when I was rather afraid it would be necessary to have you killed." Quillen laughed. "There was a time," he admitted, "when I suspected you might be thinking along those lines, First Lady. Didn't lose too much, did you?" "I lost enough," Lyad said. She wrinkled her nose at him. "But that's all over and done with. And now, No more business tonight, I promise." She turned her head a little. "Flam," she called. "Yes, First Lady," said the voice of the red-headed girl. "Bring us Miss Argy's property, please." Flam brought in a small package of flat discs taped together. Lyad took them. "Sometimes," she told Quillen, "the ASCAP becomes a little independent. He's been spoken to. Here, you keep them for Trigger." She tossed the package lightly over to them. Quillen put out a hand and caught it. "Thanks," he said. He put the package in a pocket. "I'll call off my beagles." "Suit yourself as to that," said the Ermitine. "It won't hurt the ASCAP to stay frightened a little longer." She checked herself. The room's comweb was signaling. Varad went over to it. A voice came through. "The Garth Manon subspace run begins in 1 hour. Rest cubicles have been prepared." "That means me," Belchik Pluli said. He climbed hastily to his feet. "Can't stand dives. Get hallucinations. Nasty ones." He staggered a little then, and Trigger realized for the first time that Belchy had got pretty thoroughly drunk. "Better give our guest a hand, Varad," Lyad called over her shoulder. "Happy dreams, Belchik. Are you going by rest, Trigger? No? You're not, of course, Quillen. Balmorden?" The Devagas scientist also shook his head. "Then, by all means," Lyad said, "let's stay together a little while longer." End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy. Chapter 15. "She," said Trigger, "is a remarkable woman." "Yeah," said Quillen, "remarkable." "May I ask you finally a few pertinent questions?" Trigger inquired humbly. "Not here, sweet stuff," said Quillen. "You're a bossy sort of slob, Hezlet Quillen," she said equably. Quillen didn't answer. They had come down the stairway to the storeroom's level, and were walking along the big lit hallway toward their cabins. Trigger felt pleasantly relaxed. But she did have a great many pertinent questions to ask Quillen now, and she wanted to get started on them. "Oh," she said suddenly. Just as suddenly, Quillen's hand was on her shoulder, moving her along. "Hush now," he said, "and keep walking." "But you saw it, didn't you?" Trigger asked, trying to look back to the small open door into the storerooms they'd just passed. Quillen sighed. "Certainly," he said. "Guy in space armor." "But what's he doing here?" "Checking something, I suppose." His hand left her shoulder, and for just a moment his finger rested lightly across her lips. Trigger glanced up at him. He was walking on beside her, not looking at her. All right, she thought. She could take a hint. But she felt tense and uncomfortable now. Something was going on again, apparently. They turned into the side passage and came up to her cabin. Trigger started to turn to face him, and Quillen picked her up and went on without a noticeable break in his stride. Close to her ear, his voice whispered, "Explain in a moment. Dangerous here." As the door to the end cabin closed behind them, he put her back on her feet. He looked at his watch. "We can talk here," he said, "but there may not be much time for conversation." He gestured toward a table against the wall. "Take a look at the setup." Trigger looked. The table was littered with instruments, like an electronic workbench. A visual screen showed a view of both her own cabin and a section of the passage outside it, up to the point where it entered the big hall. "What is it?" she asked uncertainly. "Essentially," said Quillen, "we've set up a Catassin trap." "Catassin?" Trigger squeaked. "That's right. Don't get too nervous, though. I've caught them before. Used to be a sort of specialty of mine. And there's one thing about them. They'll blab their pointed little heads off if you can get one alive and promise it it's catnip. He'd shucked off his jacket and taken out of it a very large handgun with a bell-shaped mouth. He laid the gun down next to the view screen. "In case," he said unreassuringly. "Now, just a moment." He sat down in front of the view screen and did something to it. "All right," he said then. "We're here and set. Probability period starts in 3 minutes, continues for 60. Signal on any blip. Otherwise, no gabbing. And remember, they're fast. Don't get sappy." There was no answer. Quillen did something else to the screen and stood up again. He looked broodingly at Trigger. "It's those damn computers again," he said. "I don't see any sense in it." "In what?" she asked shakily. "Everything that's happening around here is being fed back to them at the moment," he said. "When they heard about our invite to Lyad's dinner party and who was to be present, they came up with a honey. In the time period I mentioned, a catassin is supposed to show up at your cabin. They give it a pretty high probability." Trigger didn't say anything. If she had, she probably would have squeaked again. "Now don't worry," he said, squeezing her shoulder reassuringly between a large thumb and 4 slightly less large fingers. "Nice muscle," he said absently. "The cabin's trapped, and I've taken other precautions." He massaged the muscle gently. "Probably the only thing that will happen is that we'll sit around here for an hour or so, and then we'll have a hearty laugh together at those foolish computers." He smiled. "I thought," Trigger said without squeaking, "that everybody was pretty sure it was dead." Quillen frowned. "Well, that's something else again. There are at least 2 ways I know of to sneak it past that search. Jump it out and in with a sub-tub is one. They could have done that from their own cabin as soon as they had its pattern. So I don't really think it's dead. It's just—" "Quillen," a tiny voice said from the viewer. He turned, took 2 steps, and sat down fast before the viewer. "Go ahead." "Fast motion in B section. Going your way." Fast motion. A thought flicked up. "Quillen," Trigger began. He raised a shushing hand. "Get a silhouette?" he asked. His hands went to a set of control switches and stayed there. "No, pickup shows a haze-like in the reconstruct." An instant's pause. "Leaving B section." "Motion in C section," said another voice. Quillen said, "All right, it's coming. No more verbal reports unless it changes direction. If you want to stay alive, don't move unless you're in armor." There was silence. Quillen sat unmoving, eyes fixed on the screen. Trigger stood just behind him. Her legs had begun to tremble. She'd better tell him. "Quillen." For an instant, in the screen, there was something like heat shimmer at the far end of the passage. Then she saw her cabin door pop open. The interior of the cabin showed in a brief flare of blue light. In it was a shape. It vanished instantly again. She heard Quillen make a shocked, incredulous sound. His left hand slashed at a switch on the panel. 20 feet from them, just behind the closed door to the passage, was a splatting noise like a tremendous slap. Then another noise, strangely like a brief cloudburst. Then silence again. She realized Quillen was on his feet beside her, the oversized gun in his hand. It was pointed at the door. His eyes switched suddenly from the door to the screen and back again. She felt him relaxing slowly. Then she discovered she was clutching a handful of his shirt along with a considerable chunk of tough skin. She went on clutching it. "Fly swatter got it," he said. "Phew." He looked down and patted the clutching hand. No catassin. The trap in the cabin just wasn't fast enough. Had a gravity mine outside our door just in case. That was barely fast enough. For once, Quillen looked almost awed. Like... Trigger began. She tried again. "Like a little yellow man?" "You saw it?" In the cabin? Yes. Never saw anything just like it before. Trigger pressed her lips together to make them stay steady. I have, she said. That's what I was trying to tell you. Quillen stared at her for an instant. You'll tell me about it in a couple of minutes. I've got some quick work to do first. He checked himself. A wide grin spread suddenly over his face. Know something, doll? What? The damn computers, Major Quillen said happily. They goofed. The gravity mine would have reduced almost any life form which moved into its field to a rather thin smear, but there wasn't even that left of the yellow demon shape. Something, presumably something it was carrying, had turned it into a small blaze of incandescent energy as the mine flattened it out, which explained the sound like a cloudburst. That had been the passage's automatic fire extinguishers going into brief but correspondingly violent action. Quillen's group stayed out of sight for the time being. He barely got the mine put away, along with a handful of warped metal slugs, which was what the mine had left of their attackers' mechanical equipment, and Trigger's cabin door locked again, when 3 visitors came zooming down the storeroom's hall in a small car. A ship's engineer and 2 assistants had arrived to check on what had started the extinguishers. They may, Quillen said hopefully, just go away again. He and Trigger were watching the engineers through the viewer, which had been extended to cover their end of the passage. They didn't just go away. They checked the extinguishers, looked at the floor, still wet but rapidly absorbing the last drops of the brief deluge. They exchanged puzzled comment. They checked everything once more. Finally, the leader made use of the door announcer and asked if he might intrude. Quillen switched off the viewer. "Come in," he said resignedly. The door opened. The 3 glanced at Quillen, and then at Trigger plus Belden. Their eyes widened only slightly. Duty on the Dawn City produced hardened men. Neither Quillen nor Trigger could offer the slightest explanation as to what had started the extinguishers. The engineers apologized and withdrew. The door closed again. Quillen switched on the viewer. Their voices came back into the cabin as they climbed into their car. "So that's how it happened," one of the assistants was saying reflectively. "Right," said the ship's engineer. "Like to burst into flames myself." "Ha ha ha!" They drove off. Trigger flushed. She looked at Quillen. "Perhaps I ought to get into something else," she said, "now that the party's over." "Perhaps," Quillen admitted. "I'll have Gaia bring something down. We want to stay out of your cabin for an hour or so, till everything's been checked. There'll be a few conferences to go through now." Gaia arrived next with clothes. Trigger retired to the cabin's bathroom with them and came out a few minutes later, dressed again. Meanwhile, the Dawn City's first security officer also had arrived and was setting up a portable restructure stage in the center of the cabin. He looked rather grim, but he also looked like a very much relieved man. "I suggest we run your sequence off first, Major," he said. "Then we can put them on together and compare them." Trigger sat down on a couch beside Gaia to watch. She'd been told that the momentary view of the little demon shape in the cabin had been deleted from security's copy of their own sequence and wasn't to be mentioned. Otherwise, there really was not too much to see. What the attacking creature had used to blur the restructure wasn't clear, except that it wasn't a standard scrambler. Amplified to the limits of clarity and stepped down in time to the limit of immobility, all that emerged was a shifting haze of energy, which very faintly hinted at a dwarfish human shape in outline. A rather unusually small and heavy catassin, the security chief pointed out, would present such an outline. That something quite material was finally undergoing devastating structural disorganization on the gravity mine was unpleasantly obvious, but it produced no further information. The sequence ended with the short blaze of heat which had set off the extinguishers. Then they ran the restructure of the preceding double killing. Trigger watched, gulping a little, till it came to the point where the haze shape actually was about to touch its victims. Then she studied the carpet carefully until Gaia nudged her to indicate the business was over. Catassins almost invariably used their natural equipment in the kill. It was a swift process, of course, but shockingly brutal, and Trigger didn't care to remember what the results looked like in a human being. Both men had been killed in that manner, and the purpose obviously was to conceal the fact that the killer was not a Catassin, but something even more efficient along those lines. It didn't occur to the security chief to question Trigger. A temporal restructure of a recent event was a far more reliable witness than any set of human senses and memory mechanisms. He left presently, reassured that the Catassin incident was concluded. It startled Trigger to realize that security did not seem to be considering seriously the possibility of discovering the human agent behind the murders. Quillen shrugged. Whoever did it is covered 3 ways in every direction. The chief knows it. He can't psych 4,000 people on general suspicions, and he'd hit mind blocks in every 20th passenger presently on board if he did. Anyway, he knows we're on it, and that we have a great deal better chance of nailing the responsible characters eventually. "More information for the computers, eh?" Trigger said. "Uh-huh." "You got this little chunk the hard way, I feel," she observed. "True," Quillen admitted. "But we have to get it any way we can till we get enough to move on. Then we move." He looked at her with an air of regarding a new idea. "You know," he said, "you don't do badly for an amateur." "She doesn't do badly," Gaia's voice said behind Trigger, "for anybody. How do you people feel about a drink?" "I thought I could use one myself, after looking at the chief's restructure." Trigger felt herself coloring. Praise from the cloak and dagger experts. For some reason, it pleased her immensely. She turned her head to smile at Gaia, standing there with 3 glasses on a tray. "Thanks," she said. She took one of the glasses. Gaia held the tray out to Quillen and took the 3rd glass herself. It was some 5 minutes later when Trigger remarked, "You know, I'm getting sleepy." Quillen looked around the viewer equipment he and Gaia were dismantling. "Why not hit the couch over there and take a nap?" he suggested. "It'll be about an hour before the boys can get down here for the real conference." "Good idea." Trigger yawned, finished her drink, put the glass on a table, and wandered over to the couch. She stretched out on it. A drowsy somnolence enveloped her almost instantly. She closed her eyes. 10 minutes later, Gaia, standing over her, announced, "Well, she's out." "Fine," said Quillen, packaging the rest of the equipment. "Tell them to haul in the rest cubicle. I'll be done here in a minute. Then you and the Lady Warden can take over." Gaia looked down at Trigger. There was a trace of regret in her face. "I think," she said, "she's going to be fairly displeased with you when she wakes up and finds she's on Manon." "Wouldn't doubt it," said Quillen. "But from what I've seen of that chick, she's going to get fairly displeased with me from time to time on this operation anyway." Gaia looked at his back. "Major Quillen," she said, "would you like a tip from a keen-eyed operator?" "Go ahead, old keen-eyed op," Quillen said in kindly tones. "Not that you don't have it coming, boy," said Gaia, "but watch yourself. This one is dangerous. This one could sink you for keeps." "You're going out of your mind, doll," said Quillen. End of Chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy, Chapter 16. The pre-called headquarters dome on Manon Planet was still in the spot where Trigger had left it, looking unchanged. But everything else in the area seemed to have been moved, improved, expanded, or taken away entirely, and unfamiliar features had appeared. In the screens of Commissioner Tate's pre-call offices, Trigger could see both the new metropolitan-sized spaceport on which the Dawn City had set down that morning, and the towering glassy structures of the giant shopping and recreation center, which had been opened there recently by Grand Commerce in its bid for a cut of prospective outworld salaries. The salaries weren't entirely prospective either. 10 miles away on the other side of Headquarters Dome, new squares of living domes were sprouting up daily. At this morning's count, they housed 52,000 people. The hub's major industries and assorted branches of Federation government had established a solid foothold on Manon. Trigger turned her head as Holati Tate came into the office. He closed the door carefully behind him. "How's the little critter doing?" he asked. "Still absorbing the goop," Trigger said. She held Mantelish's small mystery plasmoid cupped lightly between thumbs and fingers, its bottom side down in a shallow bowl half full of something which Mantelish considered to be nutritive for plasmoids, or at least for this one. Its sides pulsed lightly and regularly against her palms. "The level of the stuff keeps going down," she added. "Good," said Holati. He pulled a chair up to the table and sat down opposite her. He looked broodingly at Plasmoid 113A. "You really think this thing likes me, personally?" Trigger inquired. Her boss said, "It's eating, isn't it? And moving. There were a couple of days before you got here when it looked pretty dead to me." "Hard to believe," Trigger observed, "that a sort of leech-looking thing could distinguish between people." "This one can. Do you get any sensations while holding it?" "Sensations?" She considered. "Nothing particular. It's just like I said the other time. Little repulsive is rather nice to feel." "For you," he said. "I didn't tell you everything." "You rarely do," Trigger remarked. "I'll tell you now," said Holati. "The day after we left, when it started acting very agitated and then very droopy, Mantelish said it might be missing the female touch it had got from you. He was being facetious, I think, but I couldn't see any reason not to try it, so I called in your facsimile and had her sit down at the table where the thing was lying." "Yes?" "Well, first it came flying up to her, crying Mama. Not actually, of course. Then it touched her hand and recoiled in horror." Trigger raised an eyebrow. "It looked like it," he insisted. "We all commented on it. So then she reached out and touched it. Then she recoiled in horror." "Why?" "She said it had given her a very nasty electric jolt. Apparently like the one it gave Mantelish." Trigger glanced down dubiously at Repulsive. "Gee, thanks for letting me hold it, Holati. It seems to have stopped eating now, by the way. Or whatever it does. Doesn't look much fatter, if any, does it?" The Commissioner looked. "No," he said. "And if you weighed it, you'd probably find it still weighs an exact 3.5 pounds. Mantelish feels the thing turns any food intake directly into energy." "Then it should be able to produce a very nice jolt at the moment," Trigger commented. "Now, what do I do with Repulsive?" Holati took a towel from beneath the table and spread it out. "Absorbent material," he said. "Lay it on that and just let it dry. That's what we used to do." Trigger shook her head. "Next thing, I'll be changing its diapers." "It isn't that bad," the Commissioner said. "Anyway, you will adopt the baby, won't you?" "I suppose I have to." She placed the plasmoid on the towel, wiped her hands, and stepped back from it. "What happens if it falls on the floor?" "Nothing," Holati said. "It just moves on in the direction it was going. Pretty hard to hurt those things." "In that case," Trigger said, "let's check out its container now." The Commissioner took Repulsive's container out of a desk safe and handed it to her. Its outer appearance was that of a neat modern woman's handbag with a shoulder strap. It had an anti-grav setting which would reduce its overall weight, with the plasmoid inside, down to 9 ounces if Trigger wanted it that way. It also had a combination lock, unmarked, virtually invisible, the settings of which Trigger already had memorized. Without knowing the settings, a determined man using a high-powered needle blaster might have opened the handbag in around 9 hours. A very special job. Trigger ran through the settings, opened the container, and peered inside. Rather cramped, she observed. Not for one of them. We need a room for the gadgetry. Yes, she said. Subspace rotation. She shook her head. Is that another Space Scout invention? No, said Holati. They stole it from subspace engineers. Engineers don't know we have it yet. Far as I know, nobody else has got it from them. Go ahead, give it a try. I was going to. Trigger snapped the container shut, slipped the strap over her shoulder, and stood straight, left hand closed over the lower rim of the purse-like object. She shifted the ball of her thumb and the tip of her middle finger to the correct spots and began to apply pressure. Then she started. Handbag and strap had vanished. Feels odd. She smiled. And to bring it back, I just have to be here, the same place, and say those words. He nodded. Want to try that now? Trigger waved her left hand gently through the air beside her. What happens, she asked, if the thing surfaces exactly where my hand happens to be? It won't surface if there's anything bulkier than a few dust motes in the way. That's one improvement the sub-engineers haven't heard about yet. Well... She glanced around, picked up a plastic ruler from the desk behind her, and moved back a cautious step. She waved the ruler's tip gingerly about in the area where the handbag had been. "Come, Fido," she said. Nothing happened. She drew the ruler back. "Come, Fido." Handbag and strap materialized in midair and thumped to the floor. "Convinced?" Olati asked. He picked up the handbag and gave it back to her. "It seems to work. How long will that little plasmoid last if it's left in subspace like that?" He shrugged. "Indefinitely, probably. They're tough. We know that 24 hours at a stretch won't bother it in the least, so we've set that as the limit it's to stay rotated, except in emergencies. And you, and one other person I'm not to know about, but who isn't anywhere near here, can also bring it back?" "Yes, if we know the place from which it's been rotated. So the agreement is that, again, except in absolute emergencies, it will be rotated only from one of the 6 points specified and known to all 3 of us." Trigger nodded. She opened the container and went over to the table where the plasmoid still lay on its towel. It was dry by now. She picked it up. "You're a lot of trouble, Repulsive," she told it. "But these people think you must be worth it." She slipped it into the container, and it seemed to snuggle down comfortably inside. Trigger closed the handbag, lightened it to half its normal weight, slipped the strap back over her left shoulder. "And now," she inquired, "what am I to do with the stuff I usually keep in a purse?" "You'll be in a pre-call uniform while you're here. We've had a special uniform made for you. Extra pockets." Trigger sighed. "Oh, they're quite inconspicuous and convenient," he assured her. "We checked with the girls on that." "I'll bet," she said. "Did they okay the porgy pouch, too?" "Sure. Porgy doping is a big thing all over the hub at the moment. Among the ladies, anyway. Shows you're the delicate sort, or something like that. I forget what they said. Want to start carrying it?" "Hand it over," Trigger said resignedly. "I did see quite a few pouches on the ship. Might as well get people used to thinking I've turned into a porgy sniffer." Olati went back to the desk safe and took out a flat pouch, the length of his hand but narrower. He gave it to her. It appeared to be worked of gold thread. One side was studded with tiny pearls, the opposite surface was plain. Trigger laid the plain side against the cloth of her skirt just below the right hip and let go. It adhered there. She stretched her right leg out to the side and considered the porgy pouch. "Doesn't look too bad," she conceded. "That's real porgy in the top section?" "The real article. Close to 950 credits worth." "Suppose somebody wants to borrow a sniff. Wouldn't be good to have them fumbling around the pouch very much." "They can't," said the Commissioner. "That's why we made it porgy. When you buy a supply, it has to be adjusted to your individual chemistry exactly. That's mainly what makes it expensive. Try using someone else's, and it'll flip you across the room." "Better get this adjusted to my chemistry, then. I might have to make a demonstration sniff now and then to make it look right." "We've already done that," he said. "Good," said Trigger. "Now, let's see." She straightened up, left hand closed lightly around the bottom of the purse, right hand loose at her side. Her eyes searched the office briefly. "Some object around here you don't particularly value?" she asked. "Something largish?" "Several," the Commissioner said. He glanced around. "That overgrown flower pot in the corner is one. Why?" "Just practicing," said Trigger. She turned to face the flower pot. "That will do. Now, here I come along, thinking of nothing." She started walking toward the flower pot. Then, suddenly, in front of me, there stands a plasmoid snatcher. She stopped in mid-stride. Handbag and strap vanished as her right hand slapped the porgy pouch. The Denton popped into her palm. The flower pot screeched and flew apart. "Golly," she said, startled. "Come, Fido." Handbag and strap reappeared, and she reached out and caught the strap. She looked around at Commissioner Tate. "Sorry about your pot, Holati. I was just going to shake it up a little. I forgot you people have been handling my gun. I keep it switched to stun her myself when I'm carrying it," she said pointedly. "Perfectly all right about the pot," the Commissioner said. "I should have warned you. Otherwise, I'd say all you need is a moment to see them coming." Trigger spun the Denton to its stunner setting and laid it back inside the slit which had appeared along the side of the porgy pouch. She ran thumb and fingertip along the length of the slit, and the pouch was sealed again. "That's the part that's worrying me," she admitted. When Trigger presented herself at Commissioner Tate's personal quarters early that evening, she found him alone. "Sit down," he said. "I've been trying to get hold of Mantelish for the past hour. He's over on the other side of the planet again." Trigger sat down and lifted an eyebrow. "Should he be?" "I don't think so," said Holati. "But I've been overruled on that. He's still the best man the Federation has working on the various plasmoid problems, so I'm not to interfere with his investigations any more than I can show is absolutely necessary. It's probably all right. Those U-League guards of his aren't a bad group." "If they compare with the boys the League had watching the Plasmoid project, they should be just about tops," Trigger said. "The Space Scouts thank you for those kind words," the Commissioner told her. "Those weren't League guards. When it came to deciding who was to keep an eye on you, I overruled everybody." She smiled. "I might have guessed it. What's there for the Professor to be investigating on the other side of Manon?" "He's hunting for some theoretical creatures he calls wild plasmoids." "Wild plasmoids?" "Uh-huh. His idea is that some of the plasmoids the old Galactics were using on Manon might have got away from them, or just been left lying around, so to speak, and could have survived till now. He thinks they might even be reproducing themselves. He's looking for them with a special detector he built." Trigger held up a finger on which was a slim gold ring with a small green stone in it. "Like this one?" she asked. "He's got a large version of that type of detector with him, too. But he thinks that if any wild plasmoids are around, they're likely to be along the lines of 113A. So he's also constructed a detector which reacts to 113A." "I see." Trigger was silent a moment. "Does Mantelish have any idea why Repulsive is the only plasmoid known to which our ring detectors don't react?" "Apparently he does," Holati said. "But when he starts in on those subjects, I find him difficult to follow." He looked soberly at Trigger. "There are times," he confessed, "when I suspect Professor Mantelish is somewhat daft. But probably he's just so brilliant that he keeps fading beyond my mental range." Trigger laughed. My father used to come home from a session with Mantelish muttering the same sort of thing." She glanced at the ring again. "By the way, have any plasmoids actually been stolen around here for us to detect?" He nodded. "Quite a few have been snitched from Harvest Moon and various storage points by now. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them turn up here in the dome eventually. Not that it's a serious loss. What the thieves have been getting away with is small stuff, plasmoid nuts and bolts, so to speak. Still, each of those would still fetch around 100,000 credits if you offer them to the right people. Incidentally, if asking you to this conference has interfered with any personal plans, just say so. We can put it off till tomorrow. Especially since it's beginning to look as if Mantelish won't make it here either." "Either?" Trigger said. "Quillen's already had to cancel. He got involved with something during the afternoon." "Oh," she said coolly. She looked at her watch. "I do have a dinner date with Brule Inger in an hour and a half. But you said this meeting wasn't to take more than an hour anyway, didn't you?" He nodded. "Then I'm free. My quarters are arranged, and I'm ready to go back on my old job in the morning." "Fine," said the Commissioner. "There are things I wanted to discuss with you privately anyway. If we can't get through to Mantelish in another 10 minutes, we'll go ahead with that. I would have liked to have Quillen here to fill us in with data about some of the top-level crooks in the hub. They're a specialty of his. I don't know too much about them myself." He paused. "That Lyed Emertine now," he said, "looks as if she either already is part of the main problem, or is working very hard to get there. She had a Trinest warship stationed here for the past 2 weeks, a thing called the Aurora." Trigger was startled. "But warships aren't allowed in Manon system." "It isn't in the system. It's stationed a half-light-year away, where it has a legal right to be. Nothing to worry about as such. It's just a heavy-armed frigate, which is the limit Trinest is allowed to build. Since it's Lyad's private boat, I imagine it's been souped up with everything they could throw in. Anyway, the fact that she sent it here ahead of her indicates she isn't just dropping in for a casual visit." "She made that pretty clear herself," Trigger said. "Why do you think she's being so open about it?" He shrugged. "Might have a number of reasons. One could be that she'd get the beady eye anyway as soon as she showed up here. When Lyad goes anywhere, it's usually on business. After Quillen reported on your dinner party, I got all the information I could on her. The First Lady stacks up as a tough cookie. Also smart. Most of those Emertines wind up being dead-brained by some loving relative, and apparently they have to know how to whip up a sharp brew of poison before they're led into kindergarten. Lyad's been top dog among them since she was 18. His head turned. A bell had begun pinging in the next room. He stood up. "Probably Mantelish's outfit on the transmitter," he said. "I told them to call as soon as they located him." He stopped at the door. "Care for a drink, Trigger Girl? You know where the stuff is." "Not just now, thanks." The Commissioner came back in a couple of minutes. "Darn fool got lost in a swamp. They found him finally, but he's too tired to come over now." He sat down and scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Do you remember the time you passed out on the Harvest Moon?" he asked. Trigger looked at him, puzzled. "The time I what?" "Passed out. Fainted. Went out cold." "I? You're out of your mind, Holati. I never fainted in my life." "Reason I asked," he said, "is that I've been told a spell in a rest cubicle, same thing as a rest cubicle anyway, only it's used for therapy, sometimes resolves amnesias." "Amnesias? What are you talking about?" The Commissioner said, "I'm talking about you. This is bound to be a jolt, Trigger Girl. Might have been easier after a drink, but I'll just give it to you straight. About a week after Mantelish and his U-League crew first arrived here, you did pass out on one occasion while we were on the Harvest Moon with them. And afterwards, you didn't remember doing it." "I didn't?" Trigger said weakly. "No. I thought it might have cleared up, and you just had some reason for not wanting to mention it." He got to his feet. "Like that drink now, before I go on with the details?" She nodded. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy. Chapter 17. Holati Tate brought her the drink and went on with the details. Trigger and he, and a dozen or so of the first group of U-League investigators, had been in what was now designated as Section 52 of Harvest Moon. The commissioner was by himself, checking over some equipment which had been installed in one of the compartments. After a while, Dr. Azal joined him and told him Mantelish and the others had gone on to another section. Holati and Azal finished the checkup together and were about to leave the area to catch up with the group when Holati saw Trigger lying on the floor in an adjoining compartment. "You seem to be in some kind of coma," he said. "We picked you up and put you into a chair by one of the survey screens, and were trying to get out a call on Azal's suit communicator to the ambulance boat when you suddenly opened your eyes. You looked at me and said, 'Oh, there you are. I was just going to go looking for you.' It was obvious that you didn't realize anything unusual had happened." Azal started to say something, but I stepped on his foot, and he caught on. In fact, he caught on so fast that I became a little suspicious of him. "Poor Azal," Trigger said. "Poor nothing," the commissioner said cryptically. "I'll tell you about that some other time." I cautioned Dr. Azal to say nothing to anybody until the incident had been clarified, in view of the stringent security precautions being practiced. Supposedly being practiced, he amended. Then he'd return to Man and Planet with Trigger immediately, where she was checked over by Precall's medical staff. Physically, there wasn't a thing wrong with her. "And that," said Trigger, feeling a little frightened, "is something else I don't remember." "Well, you wouldn't," the commissioner said. "You were fed a hypno-spray first. You went out for 3 hours. When you woke up, you thought you'd been having a good nap. Since the medics were sure you hadn't picked up some odd plasmoid infection, I wanted to know just what else had happened on Harvest Moon. One of those scientific big shots might also have used a hypno-spray on you, with the idea of turning you into a conditional assistant for future shenanigans." Trigger grinned faintly. "You do have a suspicious mind." The grin faded. "Was that what they were going to find out in that mind search interview on McCadden I skipped out on?" "It's one of the things they might have looked for," he agreed. Trigger gazed at him very thoughtfully for a moment. "Well, I loused that deal up," she remarked. "But why is everybody—" She shook her head. "Excuse me. Go on." The commissioner went on. "Old Dockley Harvest was handling the hypnosis herself. She hit what she thought might be a mind block when she tried to get you to remember what happened. We know now it wasn't a mind block, but she wouldn't monkey with you any farther and told me to get in an expert. So I called the Psychology Services headquarters in Oredo." Trigger looked startled, then laughed. "The eggheads? You went right to the top there, didn't you?" "Tried to," said Holati Tate. "It's a good idea when you want real service. They told me to stay calm and to say nothing to you. An expert would be shipped out promptly." "Was he?" "Yes." Trigger's eyes narrowed a little. "Same old hypno-spray treatment?" "Right," said Commissioner Tate. "He came, sprayed, investigated. Then he told me to stay calm and went off looking puzzled." "Puzzled?" she said. "If I hadn't known before that experts come in all grades," the commissioner said, "I'd know it now. That first one they sent was just sharp enough to realize there might be something involved in the case he wasn't getting, but that was all." Trigger was silent a moment. "So there've been more of those investigations I don't know about?" she observed, her voice taking on an edge. "Uh-huh," the commissioner said cautiously. "How many?" "7. Trigger flushed, straightened up, eyes blazing, and pronounced a very unladylike word. "Excuse me," she added a moment later. "I got carried away." "Perfectly all right," said the commissioner. "I've been getting just a bit fed up anyway," Trigger went on, voice and color still high, "with people knocking me for a loop one way or another whenever they happen to feel like it." "Don't blame you a bit," he said. "And please don't think I don't appreciate your calling in all those experts. I do. It's just their sneaky, underhanded, secretive methods I don't go for." "Exactly how I feel about it," said the commissioner. Trigger stared at him suspiciously. "You're a pretty sneaky type yourself," she said. "Well, excuse the blow-up, Holati. They probably had some reason for it. Have they found out anything at all with all the spraying and investigating?" "Oh, yes. They seem to have made considerable progress. The last report I had from them, about a month ago, shows that the original amnesia had been completely resolved." Trigger looked surprised. "If it's been resolved," she said reasonably, "why don't I remember what happened?" "You aren't supposed to become conscious of it before the final interview. I don't know the reason for that. But the memory is available now. On tap, so to speak. They'll give you a cue, and then you'll remember it." "Just like that, eh?" She paused. "So, the psychology service is what's it?" "What's it?" said the commissioner. She explained about what's it. He grinned. "Yes," he said. "They're the ones who've been giving the instructions, as far as you're concerned." Trigger was silent a moment. "I've heard," she said, "the eggheads have terrific pull when they want to use it. You don't hear much about them otherwise. Let me think just a little." "Go ahead," said Holati. A minute ticked away. "What it boils down to so far," Trigger said then, "is still pretty much what you told me on McCadden. The psychology service thinks I know something that might help clean up the plasmoid problem, or at least help explain it." He nodded. "And the people who've been trying to grab me very probably are doing it for exactly the same reason." He nodded again. "That's almost certain." "Do you think the eggheads might already have figured out what the connection is?" The commissioner shook his head. "If they had, we'd be doing something about it. The Federation Council is very nervous." "Well," Trigger said. She pursed her lips. "That Lyad," she said. "What about her?" "She tried to hire me," said Trigger. "Major Quillen reported it, I suppose?" "Sure." "And it wouldn't be just to steal some stupid plasmoid, especially since you say a number of small ones are already available. Then they're the ones that Raiders picked up in the hub. She probably has a collection by now." He nodded. "Probably." "She seems to know quite a bit about what's going on." "Very likely she does." "Let's grab her," said Trigger. "We can do it quietly, and she's too big to be mind-blocked. We get part of the answer, perhaps all of it." Something flared briefly in the commissioner's small gray eyes. He reached over and patted her knee. "You're a girl after my own heart, Trigger girl," he said. "I'm for it. But half the council would have fainted dead away if they heard you make that suggestion." "They're as touchy as that?" she asked, disappointed. "Yes, and you can't quite blame them. Fumbles could be pretty bad. When it comes to someone around Lyad's level, our own group is restricted to defensive counteraction. If we get evidence against her, it'll be up to the diplomats to decide what's to be done about it. Tactfully. We wouldn't be further involved." Trigger nodded, watching him. "Go on." "Well, defensive counteraction can cover a lot of things, of course. If we actually run into the First Lady while we're engaged in it, we'll hold her, as long as we can. And from all accounts, now that she showed up to take personal charge of things around here, we can expect some very fast, very direct action from Lyad." "How fast?" "My own guess," said the Commissioner, "would be around a week. If she hasn't moved by then, we might help things along a little." "Make a few of those openings for her, eh? Well, that doesn't sound too bad." Trigger reflected. "Then there's point number 2, she said. "What's that?" She grimaced. "I'm not real keen on it," she confessed, "but I think we better do something about that interview with Whatsit I ducked out of. If they still want to talk to me." "They do, very much so." "What's that business about their saying it was okay now for me to go on to Manon?" Commissioner Tate tugged gently at his left earlobe. "Frankly," he said, "that's something that shook me a little." "Shook you? Why?" "It's that matter of experts coming in grades. The upper ranks in the psychology service are extremely busy people, I understand. After your first interview, we were shifted upward promptly. A couple of middling, high-bracket investigators took over for a while. But after the 4th interview, I was told I'd have to bring you to the hub to let somebody really competent handle the next stage of whatever they've been doing. They said they couldn't spare anybody of that caliber for a trip to Manon." "Was that the real reason we went to McCadden?" Trigger asked, startled. "Sure. But we still hadn't got anywhere near the service's top level then. As I get it, their top-notchers don't spend much time on individual cases. They keep busy with things on the scale of our more bothersome planetary cultures. And there are supposed to be only 100 or so of them in that category. So I was more than a little surprised when the service informed me finally one of those people was coming to McCadden to conduct your 9th interview." "One of the real eggheads," Trigger smiled nervously. "And then I just took off. They can't have too good an opinion of me at the moment, you know." "Apparently that didn't upset them in the least," the Commissioner said. "They told me to stay calm and make sure you got to Manon all right. Then they said they had a ship operating in this area, and they routed over to Manon after you arrived here." "A ship?" Trigger asked. "I've seen a few of their ships. They looked like oversized flying mountains, camouflage jobs. What they actually are is space-going super-laboratories, from what I've heard. This one has a couple of those top-notchers on board, and one of them will take you on. It's due here in a day or so." Trigger had paled somewhat. "You know," she said, "I feel a little shaken myself now." "I'm not surprised," said the Commissioner. She shook her head. "Well, if they're top-notchers, they must know what they're doing." She gave him a smile. "Looks like I'm something extremely unusual. Like a bothersome planetary culture." "Weak joke," she added. The Commissioner ignored the weak joke. "There's another thing," he said thoughtfully. "What's that?" "When I mentioned your reluctance about being interviewed, they told me not to worry about it, that you wouldn't try to duck out again. That's why I was surprised when you brought up the matter of the interview yourself just now." "Now that is odd," Trigger admitted after a pause. "How would they know?" "Right," he said. He sighed. "Guess we're both a little out of our depth here. I've come close to getting impatient with them a few times. Had the feeling they were stalling me off and holding back information. But presumably they do know what they're doing." He glanced at his watch. "That hour's about up now, by the way." "Well, if there's something else that should be discussed, I can break my dinner date," Trigger said, somewhat reluctantly. "I had a chance to talk with Brule at the spaceport for a while when we came in this morning." "I wasn't suggesting that," said Holati. "There still are things to be discussed, but a few hours one way or the other won't make any difference. We'll get together again around lunch tomorrow. Then you'll be filled in pretty well on all the main points of this business." Trigger nodded. "Fine." "What I had in mind right now was that the service people suggested having you look over their last report on you after your arrival. You'd have just enough time for that before going to keep your date. Care to do it?" "I certainly would," Trigger said. The transmitter signaled for attention while she was studying the report. Holati Tate went off to answer it. The report was rather lengthy, and Trigger was still going over it when he got back. He sat down again and waited. When she looked up finally, he asked, "Can you make much sense of it?" "Not very much," Trigger admitted. "It just states what seems to have happened, not how or why. Apparently, they did get me to develop a total recall of that knocked-out period in the last interview. I even reported hearing you and Dr. Azal moving around and talking in the next compartment." He nodded. "I remember enough of my conversation with Azal to be able to verify that part of it." "Then, sometime before I actually fell down," said Trigger, "I was apparently already in that mysterious coma. Getting deeper into it, it started when I walked away from Antelish's group, without having any particular reason for doing it. I just walked. Then I was in another compartment by myself and still walking, and the stuff kept getting deeper, until I lost physical control of myself and fell down. Then I lay there a while until you came down that aisle and saw me. And after you'd picked me up and put me in that chair, just like that, everything clears up. Except that I don't remember what happened, and think I've just left Mantelish to go looking for you. I don't even wonder how I happened to be sitting there in a chair." The Commissioner smiled briefly. "That's right, you didn't." Her slim fingers tapped the pages of the report, the green stone in the ring he'd given her to wear reflecting little flashes of light. "They seem quite positive that nobody else came near me during that period, and that nobody had used a hypnospray on me or shot a hypodermic pellet into me, anything like that, before the seizure or whatever it was came on. How do you suppose they could be so sure of that?" "I wouldn't know," Holati said, "but I think we might as well assume they're right." "I suppose so. What it seems to boil down to is they're saying I was undergoing something like a very much slowed down, very profound emotional shock, source still undetermined, but profound enough to knock me completely out for a while. Only they also say that, for a whole list of reasons, it couldn't possibly have been an emotional shock after all. And when the effect left, it went instantaneously. That would be just the reverse to the pattern of an emotional shock, wouldn't it?" "Yes," he said. "That occurred to me too, but it didn't explain anything to me. Possibly it's explained something to the psychology service." "Well," Trigger said, "it's certainly all very odd. Very disagreeable, too." She laid the report down on the arm of her chair and looked at the Commissioner. "Guess I'd better run now," she said. "But there was something you said before that made me wonder. There was really very little of Dr. Azal left after that plasmoid got through with him." He nodded. "True." "It wasn't Azal, was it?" "No." "Man, oh man!" Trigger jumped up, bent over his chair, and gave him a quick peck on an ear tip. "If I ask one more question, we'll be sitting here the next 2 hours. I'll run instead. See you around lunchtime, Commissioner." "Right, Trigger," he said, getting up. He closed the door behind her and went back to the transmitter. He looked rather unhappy. "Yes?" said a voice in the transmitter. "She just left," Commissioner Tate said. "Get on the beam and stay there." End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy, Chapter 18. "Well," Trigger said, regarding Brule critically, "I just meant to say that you're getting the least little bit plump here and there under all that tan. I'll admit it doesn't show yet when you're dressed." Brule smiled tolerantly. In silver swimming trunks and sandals, He was obviously a very handsome hunk of young man, and he knew it. So did Trigger. So did a quartet of predatory young females eyeing them speculatively from a table only 20 feet away. "I've come swimming here quite a bit since they opened the center," he said. He flexed his right arm and regarded his biceps complacently. "That's just streamlined muscle you're looking at, sweetheart." Trigger reached over and poked the biceps with a fingertip. "Muscle," she said, smiling at him. "It dents, see?" He clasped his other hand over hers and squeezed it lightly. "Oh, golly, Brule," she said happily. "I'm so glad I'm back." He gave her the smile. "You're not the only glad one." She looked around, humming softly. They were having dinner in one of the Grand Commerce Center's restaurants. This one happened to be beneath the surface of the artificial swimming lake installed in the center, a giant grotto surrounded by green-gold chasms of water on every side. Underwater swimmers and bottom walkers moved past beyond the wide windows. A streak of silvery swiftness against a dark red canyon wall before her was trying to keep away from a trio of pursuing spear fishermen. Even the lake fish were hub imports, advertised as such by the center. Her eyes widened suddenly. "Hey," she said. "What?" "That group of people up there." Brule looked. "What about them?" "No suits, you idiot." He grinned. "Oh, a lot of them do that. Okay by Federation law, you know. And seeing Manon so close to becoming open Federation territory, we haven't tried to enforce minor pre-call regulations much lately." "Well," Trigger began. He was still smiling. "Have you been doing it?" she inquired suspiciously. "Swimming in the raw? Certainly. Depends on the company. If you weren't such a little prude, I'd have suggested it tonight. Want to try it later?" Trigger colored. Prude again, she thought. "Nope," she said. "There are limits." He patted her cheek. "On you, it would look cute." She shook her head, aware of a small fluster of guilt. There had been considerably less actual coverage in the Belden costume than there was in the minute two-piece counterpart to Brule's silver trunks she wore at the moment. She'd have to tell Brule about the Belden stunt, since it was more than likely he'd hear about it from others, Neelock Pluley for one. But not now. Things were getting just a little delicate along that line at the moment. "Leave us change the subject, pig," she said cheerfully. "Tell me what else you've been doing besides acquiring a gorgeous tan." A couple of hours later, things began to get delicate again. Same subject. Trigger had been somewhat startled at the spaceport when Brule told her he had shifted his living quarters to a center apartment, and that a large number of pre-calls executives were taking similar liberties. Holati's stand-in, Acting Commissioner Chelli, apparently hadn't been too successful at keeping up personnel discipline. She hadn't said anything. It was true that Manon was still a pre-colonial planet only as a technicality. They didn't know quite as much about it as they had to know before it could be officially released for unrestricted settling, but by now there was considerable excuse for loosening up on many of the early precautionary measures. For one thing, there were just so many hub people around nowadays that it would have been a practical impossibility to enforce all pre-call rules. What bothered her mainly about the business of Brule's center apartment was that it might make the end of the evening less pleasant than she wanted it to be. Brule had become the least bit swacked. Not at all offensively, but he tended to get pretty ambitious then, and during the past few hours she'd noticed that something had changed in his attitude toward her. He'd always been confident of himself when it came to women, so it wasn't that. It was, perhaps, Trigger thought, like an unspoken ultimatum along those lines, and she'd felt herself freezing up a little in response to the thought. The apartment was very beautiful. Neelock, she guessed, or somebody else like that. Brule's taste was good, but he simply wouldn't have thought of a lot of the details here. Neither, Trigger conceded, would she. Some of the details looked pretty expensive. He came back into the living room in a dressing gown, carrying a couple of drinks. It was going to get awkward, all right. "Like it?" he asked, waving a hand around. "It's beautiful," Trigger said honestly. She smiled. She sipped at the drink and placed it on the arm of her chair. "Somebody like an interior decorator help you with it?" Brule laughed and sat down opposite her with his drink. The laugh had sounded the least bit annoyed. "You're right," he said. "How did you guess?" "You never went in for art exactly," she said. "This room is a work of art." He nodded. He didn't look annoyed anymore. He looked smug. "It is, isn't it?" he said. "It didn't even cost so very much. You just have to know how, that's all." "Know how about what?" Trigger asked. "Know how to live," Brule said. "Know what it's all about. Then it's easy." He was looking at her. The smile was there. The warm, rich voice was there. All the old charm was there. It was Brule, and it wasn't. Trigger realized she was twisting her hands together. She looked down at them. The little jewel in the ring Holati Tate had given her to wear blinked back with crimson gleamings. Crimson. She drew a long, slow breath. "Brule," she said. "Yes," said Brule. At the edge of her vision she saw the smile turn eager. Trigger said, "Give me the plasmoid." She raised her eyes and looked at him. He'd stopped smiling. Brule looked back at her a long time. At least it seemed a long time to Trigger. The smile suddenly returned. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, almost plaintively. "If it's a joke, I don't get it." "I just said," Trigger repeated carefully, "give me the plasmoid, the one you stole." Brule took a swallow of his drink and put the glass down on the floor. "Aren't you feeling well?" he asked solicitously. "Give me the plasmoid." "Honestly, Trigger." He shook his head. He laughed. "What are you talking about?" "A plasmoid. The one you took. The one you've got here." Brule stood up. He studied her face, blinking, puzzled. Then he laughed, richly. "Trigger, I fed you one drink too many. I never thought you'd let me do it. Be sensible now. If I had a plasmoid here, how could you tell?" "I can tell. Brule, I don't know how you took it or why you took it. I don't really care." And that was a lie, Trigger thought dismally. She cared. "Just give it to me and I'll put it back. We can talk about it afterwards." "Afterwards," Brule said. The laugh came again, but it sounded a little hollow. He moved a step toward her, stopped again, hands on his hips. "Trigger," he said soberly, "if I've ever done anything you mightn't approve of, it was done for both of us. You realize that, don't you?" "I think I do," Trigger said warily. "Yes. Give it to me, Brule." Brule leaped forward. She slid sideways out of the chair to the floor as he leaped. She was crying inside, she realized vaguely. Brule was going to kill her now, if he could. She caught his left foot with both hands as he came down and twisted viciously. Brule shouted something. His red, furious face swept by above. He thumped to the floor beside her, one leg flung across her thighs, gripping. In Colonial School, Brule had received the same basic training in unarmed combat that Trigger had. He was close to 80 pounds heavier than Trigger, and it was still mostly muscle. But it was nearly 4 years now since he had bothered himself with drills. And he hadn't been put through Mehul's advanced students' courses lately. He stayed conscious a little less than 9 seconds. The plasmoids were in a small electronic safe built into a music cabinet. The stamp to the safe was in Brule's billfold. There were 3 of them, about the size of mice, starfish-shaped lumps of translucent, hard, colorless jelly. They didn't move. Trigger laid them in a row on the polished surface of a small table and blinked at them for a moment from a streaming left eye. The right eye was swelling shut. Brule had got in one wild wallop somewhere along the line. She picked up a small jar, emptied some spicy-smelling, crumbly contents out on the table, dropped the plasmoids inside, closed the jar, and left the apartment with it. Brule was just beginning to stir and groan. Commissioner Tate hadn't retired yet. He let her in without a word. Trigger put the jar down on a table. "3 of your nuts and bolts in there," she said. He nodded. "I know." "I thought you did," said Trigger. "Thanks for the quick cure. But right at the moment, I don't like you very much, Holati. We can talk about that in the morning." "All right," said the Commissioner. He hesitated. "Anything that should be taken care of before then?" "It's been taken care of," Trigger said. "One of our employees has been moderately injured. I dialed the medics to go pick him up. They have. Good night." "You might let me do something for that eye," he said. Trigger shook her head. "I've got stuff in my quarters." She locked herself into her quarters, got out a jar of Quick Heal and anointed the eye and a few other minor bruises. She put the jar away, made a mechanical check of the newly installed anti-intrusion devices, dimmed the lights, and climbed into her bunk. For the next 20 minutes she wept violently. Then she fell asleep. An hour or so later, she turned over on her side and said, without opening her eyes, "Come, Fido." The plasmoid purse appeared just above the surface of the bunk between Trigger's pillow and the wall. It dropped with a small thump and stood balanced uncertainly. Trigger slept on. 5 minutes after that, the purse opened itself. A little later again, Trigger suddenly shifted her shoulder uneasily, frowned, and made a little half-angry, half-whimpering cry. Then her face smoothed out. Her breathing grew quiet and slow. Major Heslet Quillen of the Subspace Engineers came breezing into Manon Planet Spaceport very early in the morning. A pre-call aircar picked him up and let him out on a platform of the headquarters dome near Commissioner Tate's offices. Quillen was handed on toward the offices through a string of underlings and reached the door just as it opened and Trigger Argy stepped through. He grasped her cordially by the shoulders and cried out a cheery hello. Trigger made a soft growling sound in her throat. Her left hand chopped right, her right hand chopped left. Quillen grunted and let go. "What's the matter?" he inquired, stepping back. He rubbed one arm, then the other. Trigger looked at him, growled again, walked past him, and disappeared through another door, her back very straight. "Come in, Quillen," Commissioner Tate said from within the office. Quillen went in and closed the door behind him. "What did I do?" he asked bewilderedly. "Nothing much," said Holati. "You just share the misfortune of being a male human being. At the moment, Trigger's against him. She blew up the Brule Inger setup last night." "Oh." Quillen sat down. "I never did like that idea much," he said. The Commissioner shrugged. "You don't know the girl yet. If I'd hauled Inger in, she would never have really forgiven me for it. I had to let her handle it herself. Actually, she understands that." "How did it go?" "Her cover reported it was one hell of a good fight for some seconds. If you'd looked closer, you might have just spotted the traces of the shiner Inger gave her. It was a beaut last night." Quillen went white. "But if you're thinking of having a chat with Inger re that part of it," the Commissioner went on, "forget it." He glanced at a report from the medical department on his desk. Dislocated shoulder, broken thumb, moderate concussion, and so on. It was the throat punch that finished the matter. He can't talk yet. We'll call it square. Quillen grunted. "What are you going to do with him now?" "Nothing," Holati said. "We know his contacts. Why bother? He'll resign end of the month." Quillen cleared his throat and glanced at the door. "I suppose she'll want him put up for rehabilitation. Seemed pretty fond of him." "Relax, son," said the Commissioner. "Trigger's an individualist. If Inger goes up for rehabilitation, it will be because he wants it. And he doesn't, of course. Being a slob suits him fine. He's just likely to be more cautious about it in future. So we'll let him go his happy way. Now, let's get down to business. How does Pluly's yacht harem stack up?" A reminiscent smile spread slowly over Quillen's face. He shook his head. "Awesome, brother," he said. "Plain awesome." "Pick up anything useful?" "Nothing definite. But whenever Belchy comes out of the aesthetic trances, he's a worried man. Count him in." "For sure?" "Yes." "All right, he's in. Crack the Aurora yet?" "No," said Quillen. "The girls are working on it. But the Emmertyne keeps a mighty taut ship and a mighty disciplined crew. We'll have a couple of those boys wrapped up in another week. No earlier." "A week might be soon enough," said the Commissioner. "It also might not." "I know it," said Quillen. "But the Aurora does look a little bit obvious, doesn't she?" "Yes," Oladi Tate admitted. "Just a little bit." End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy, Chapter 19. By lunchtime, Trigger was acting almost cordial again. "I've got the pre-call job lined up," she reported to Oladi Tate. "I'll handle it like I used to whenever I can. When I can't, the kids will shift in automatically." The kids were the 5 assistants among whom her duties had been divided in her absence. "Major Quillen called me up to Mantelish's lab around 10, she went on. "They wanted to see Repulsive, so I took him up there. Then it turned out Mantelish wanted to take Repulsive along on a field trip this afternoon." Oladi looked startled. "He can't do that, and he knows it." He reached for the desk transmitter. "Don't bother, Commissioner. I told Mantelish I'd been put in charge of Repulsive, and that he'd lose an arm if he tried to walk out of the lab with him." Oladi cleared his throat. "I see. How did Mantelish react?" "Oh, he huffed a bit, like he does. Then he calmed down and agreed he could get by without Repulsive out there, so we stood by while he measured and weighed the thing and so on. After that, he got friendly and said you'd asked him to fill me in on current plasmoid theory." "So I did," said Oladi. "Did he?" "He tried, I think. But it's like you say. I got lost in about 3 sentences and never caught up." She looked curiously at the Commissioner. "I didn't have a chance to talk to Major Quillen alone, so I'm wondering why Mantelish was told the eye fleets in the Vishni area are hunting for planets with plasmoids on them. I thought you felt he was too woolly-minded to be trusted." "We couldn't keep that from him very well," Oladi said. "He was the boy who thought of it." "You didn't have to tell him they'd found some possibles, did you?" "He did, unfortunately. He's had those plasmoid detectors of his for about a month, but he didn't happen to think of mentioning them. The reason he was to come back to Manon originally was to sort over the stuff the fleets had been sending back here. It's a weird collection of low-grade life forms as I've ever seen, but not plasmoid. Mantelish went into a temper and wanted to know why the idiots weren't using detectors." "Oh, Lord," Trigger said. "That's what it's like when you're working with him," said the Commissioner. "We started making up detectors wholesale and rushing them out there, but the new results haven't come in yet." "Well, that explains it." Trigger looked down at the desk a moment, then glanced up and met the Commissioner's eye. She colored slightly. "Incidentally," she said, "I did take the opportunity to apologize to Major Quillen for clipping him a couple this morning. I shouldn't have done that." "He didn't seem offended," said Oladi. "No, not really," she agreed. "And I explained to him that you had a very good reason to feel disturbed." "Thanks," said Trigger. "By the way, was he really a smuggler at one time? And a hijacker? Yes, very successful at it. It's excellent cover for some phases of intelligence work. As I heard it, though, Quillen happened to scramble up one of the hub's nastier dope rings in the process, and was broken 2 grades in rank. Broken? Trigger said. Why? Unwarranted interference with the political situation. The Scouts are rough about that. You are supposed to see those things. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you do, and go ahead anyway. They may pat you on the back privately, but they also give you the axe. I see, she said. She smiled. Just how far did we get in bringing you up to date yesterday? The Commissioner asked. The remains that weren't Dr. Azal? Trigger said. If it hadn't been for the funny business with Trigger, Holati said, he mightn't have been immediately skeptical about Dr. Azal's supposed demise by plasmoid during a thrombosis-induced spell of unconsciousness. There had been no previous indications that the U-League screening of its scientists, in connection with the plasmoid find, might have been strategically loused up from the start. But as things stood, he did look on the event with very considerable skepticism. Dr. Azal's death, in that particular form, seemed too much of a coincidence. For beside himself, only Azal knew that another person already had suddenly and mysteriously lost consciousness on Harvest Moon. Only Azal, therefore, might expect that the Commissioner would quietly inform the official investigators of the preceding incident, thus cinching the accidental death theory in Azal's case much more neatly than the assumed heart attack had done. The Commissioner went on from there to the reflection that if Azal had chosen to disappear, it might well have been with the intention of conveying important information secretly back to somebody waiting for it in the hub. He saw to it that the remains were preserved, and that word of what could have happened was passed on to a high Federation official whom he knew to be trustworthy. That was all he was in a position to do, or interested in doing himself. Security men presently came and took the supposed vestiges of Dr. Azal's body back to the hub. It wasn't until some months later, when the works blew up and I was put on this job, that I heard any more about it, Holati Tate said. It wasn't Azal. It was part of some unidentifiable cadaver which he presumably brought with him for just such a use. Anyway, they had Azal's gene patterns on record, and they didn't jibe. The desk transmitter buzzed, and Trigger took it on an earphone extension. RG, she said. She listened a moment. All right, coming over. She stood up, replacing the earphone. Office tangle, she explained. Guess they feel I'm fluffing now I'm back. I'll get back here as soon as it's straightened out. Oh, by the way. Yes? The Psychology Service ship messaged in during the morning. It'll arrive sometime tomorrow, and wants a station assigned to it outside the system, where it won't be likely to attract attention. Are they really as huge as all that? I've seen 1 or 2 that were bigger, the Commissioner said, but not much. When they're stationed, they'll send someone over in a shuttle to pick me up. The Commissioner nodded. I'll check on the arrangements for that. The idea of the interview still bothering you? Well, I'd sooner it wasn't necessary, Trigger admitted, but I guess it is. She grinned briefly. Anyway, I'll be able to tell my grandchildren someday that I once talked to one of the real eggheads. The Psychology Service woman who stood up from a couch as Trigger came into the small spaceport lounge next evening looked startlingly similar to Major Quillen's Dawn City assistant, Gaia. Standing, you could see that she was considerably more slender than Gaia. She had all of Gaia's good looks. The name is Pilch, she said. She looked at Trigger and smiled. It was a good smile, Trigger thought, not the professional job she'd expected. And everyone who knows Gaia, she went on, thinks we must be twins. Trigger laughed. Aren't you? Just first cousins. The voice was all right, too, clear and easy. Trigger felt herself relax somewhat. That's one reason they picked me to come and get you. We're already almost acquainted. Another is that I've been assigned to take you through the preliminary work for your interview after we get to the ship. We can chat a bit on the way, and that should make it seem less disagreeable. Boat's in the speedboat park over there. They started down a short hallway to the park area. "Just how disagreeable is it going to be?" Trigger asked. "Not at all bad in your case. You're conditioned to the processes more than you know. Your interviewer will just pick up where the last job ended and go on from there. It's when you have to work down through barriers that you have a little trouble." Trigger was still mulling that over as she stepped ahead of Pilch into the smaller of two needle-nosed craft parked side by side. Pilch followed her in and closed the lock behind them. "The other's a combat job," she remarked. "Our escort. Commissioner Tate made very sure we had one, too." She motioned Trigger to a low, soft seat that took up half the space of the tiny room behind the lock, sat down beside her, and spoke at a wall pickup. "All set. Let's ride." Blue-green tinted sky moved past them in the little room's viewer screen. Then a tilted landscape flashed by and dropped back. Pilch winked at Trigger. "Takes off like a scared Yazong, that boy. He'll race the combat job to the ship." "About those barriers. Supposing I told you something like this. There's no significant privacy invasion in this line of work. We go directly to the specific information we're looking for and deal only with that. Your private life, your personal thoughts remain secret, sacred, and inviolate. What would you say?" "I'd say you're a liar," Trigger said promptly. "Of course, that sort of thing is sometimes told to nervous interviewees. We don't bother with it. But now supposing I told you very sincerely that no recording will be made of any little personal glimpses we may get." "Lying again." "Right again," said Pilch. "You've been scanned about as thoroughly as anyone ever gets to be outside of a total therapy. Your personal secrets are already on record, and since I'm doing most of the preparatory work with you, I've studied all the significant-looking ones very closely. You're a pretty good person for my money. All right?" Trigger studied her face uncomfortably. "Hardly all right, but—" "I guess I can stand it," she said. "As far as you're concerned, anyway." She hesitated. "What's the egghead like?" "Old Crenadan," said Pilch. "You won't mind her a bit, I think. Very motherly old type. Let's get through the preparations first, and then I'll introduce you to her. If you think it would make you more comfortable, I'll just stay around while she's working. I've sat in on her interviews before. How's that?" "Sounds better," Trigger said. She did feel a good deal relieved. They slid presently into a tunnel-like lock of the space vehicle Holati Tate had described as a flying mountain. From what Trigger could see of it in the guidelights on the approach, it did rather closely resemble a very large mountain of the craggier sort. They went through a series of lifts, portals, and passages, and wound up in a small and softly lit room with a small desk, a very large couch, a huge wall screen, and assorted gadgetry. Pilch sat down at the desk and invited Trigger to make herself comfortable on the couch. Trigger lay down on the couch. She had a very brief sensation of falling gently through dimness. Half an hour later, she sat up on the couch. Pilch switched on a desk light and looked at her thoughtfully. Trigger blinked. Then her eyes widened, first with surprise, then in comprehension. "Liar," she said. Said Pilch. "Yes. That was the interview." "True." "Then you're the egghead." "Cha," said Pilch. "Well, I believe I can modestly describe myself as being that. Yes. You're another, by the way. We're just smart about different things. Not so very different." "You were smart about this," Trigger said. She swung her legs off the couch and regarded Pilch dubiously. Pilch grinned. "Took most of the disagreeableness out of it, didn't it?" "Yes," Trigger admitted. "It did. Now what do we do?" "Now," said Pilch, "I'll explain." The thing that had caught their attention was a quite simple process. It just happened to be a process the Psychology Service hadn't observed under those particular circumstances before. "Here's what our investigators had the last time," Pilch said. "Lines and lines of stuff, of course, but here's a simple continuity which makes it clear. Your mother dies when you're 6 months old. Then there are a few nurses whom you don't like very much. Good nurses, but frankly much too stupid for you, though you don't know that, and they don't either, naturally. Next, you're 7 years old, a bit over, and there's a mud pond on the farm near Sacy where you spend all your vacations. You just love that old mud pond." Trigger laughed. "A smelly old hole, actually, full of froggy sorts of things. I went out to that farm 6 years ago just to look around it again. But you're right, I did love that mud pond once." "Right up to that 7th summer," Pilch said, "which was the summer your father's cousin spent her vacation on the farm with you." Trigger nodded. "Perhaps. I don't remember the time too well." "Well," Pilch said, "she was a brilliant woman, in some ways. She was about the age your mother had been when she died. She was very good-looking. And she was nice. She played games with a little girl, sang to her, told her stories, cuddled her." Trigger blinked. "Did she? I don't—" "However," said Pilch, "she did not play games with, tell stories to, cuddle, etc., little girls who—" Her voice went suddenly thin and edged. "Come in all filthy and smelly from that dirty, slimy old mud pond." Trigger looked startled. "You know," she said, "I do believe I remember her saying that, just that way." "You remember it," said Pilch, "now. You never saw her again after that summer. Your father had good sense. He didn't marry her, as he apparently intended to do, before he saw how she was going to be with you. You went back to your old mud pond just once more on your next vacation. She wasn't there. What had you done? You waited around, feeling pretty sad. And you stepped on a sharp stick and cut your foot badly. Sort of a self-punishment." She flipped over a few pages of some record on her desk. "Now, before you start asking what's interesting about that, I'll run over a few crossed-in items. Age 12. There's that Macadam animal like a dry-land jellyfish. A mingo, isn't it? That swallowed your kitten." "The mingo," Trigger said. "I remember that. I killed it." "Right. You kicked it apart and pulled out the kitten, but the kitten was dead and partly digested. You bawled all day and half the night about that." "I might have, I suppose." "You did. Now those are 2 centering points. There's other stuff connected with them. No need to go into details. As classes, you've stepped now and then on things that squirmed or squashed, bad smells, etc. How do you feel about plasmoids?" Trigger wrinkled her nose. "I just think they're unpleasant things. All except—" Oops, she checked herself. "Repulsive," said Pilch. "It's quite all right about repulsive. We've been informed of that super-secret little item you're guarding. If we hadn't been told, we'd know now, of course. Go ahead." "Well, it's odd," Trigger remarked thoughtfully. "I just said I thought plasmoids were rather unpleasant, but that's the way I used to feel about them. I don't feel that way now." "Except again," said Pilch, "for that little monstrosity on the ship. If it was a plasmoid. You rather suspect it was, don't you?" Trigger nodded. "That would be pretty bad." "Very bad," said Pilch. "Plasmoids generally. You feel about them now as you feel about potatoes, rocks, neutral things like that?" "That's about it," Trigger said. She still looked puzzled. "We'll go over what seems to have changed your attitude there in a minute or so. Here's another thing." Pilch paused a moment, then said, "Night before last, about an hour after you'd gone to bed, you had a very light touch of the same pattern of mental blankness you experienced on that plasmoid station." "While I was asleep?" Trigger said, startled. "That's right. Comparatively very light, very brief. 5 or 6 minutes. Dream activity, etc., smooths out. Some blocking on various sense lines. Then normal sleep until about 5 minutes before you woke up. At that point, there may have been another minute touch of the same pattern. Too brief to be actually definable. A few seconds at most. The point is that this is a continuing process." She looked at Trigger a moment. "Not particularly alarmed, are you?" "No," said Trigger. "It just seems very odd." She added, "I got rather frightened when Commissioner Tate was first telling me what had been going on." "Yes, I know." End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Legacy by James H. Schmitz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legacy, Chapter 20. Pilch was silent for some moments again, considering the wall screen as if thinking about something connected with it. "Well, we'll drop that for now," she said finally. "Let me tell you what's been happening these months, starting with that first amnesia-covered blackout on Harvest Moon. The McCadden Colonial School has sound basic psychology courses, so there won't be much explaining to do. The connection between those incidents I mentioned and your earlier feeling of disliking plasmoids is obvious, isn't it?" Trigger nodded. "Good. When you got the first service checkup at Commissioner Tate's demand, there was very little to go on. The amnesia didn't lift immediately. Not very unusual. The blankout might be interesting because of the circumstances. Otherwise, the check showed you were in a good deal better than normal condition. Outside of total therapy processes, and I believe you know that's a long haul, there wasn't much to be done for you, and no particular reason to do it. So an amnesia resolving process was initiated, and you were left alone for a while. Actually, something already was going on at the time, but it wasn't spotted until your next check. What it's amounted to has been a relatively minor but extremely precise and apparently purposeful therapy process. Your unconscious memories of those groupings of incidents I was talking about, along with various linked groupings, have gradually been cleared up. Emotion has been drained away. Fixed evaluations have faded. Associative lines have shifted. Now, that's nothing remarkable in itself. Any good therapist could have done the same for you, and much more rapidly. Say in a few hours' hard work, spread over several weeks to permit progressive assimilation without conscious disturbances. The very interesting thing is that this orderly little process appears to have been going on all by itself, and that just doesn't happen. You disturbed now?" Trigger nodded. "A little. Mainly, I'm wondering why somebody wants me to not dislike plasmoids." "So am I wondering," said Pilch. "Somebody does, obviously. And a very slick somebody it is. We'll find out by and by. Incidentally, this particular part of the business has been concluded. Apparently, somebody doesn't intend to make you wild for plasmoids. It's enough that you don't dislike them." Trigger smiled. "I can't see anyone making me wild for the things, whatever they tried." Pilch nodded. "Could be done," she said, "rather easily. You'd be bats, of course, but that's very different from a simple neutralizing process like the one we've been discussing. Now here's something else. You were pretty unhappy about this business for a while. That wasn't somebody's fault. That was us. I'll explain. Your investigators could have interfered with the little therapy process in a number of ways. That wouldn't have taught them a thing, so they didn't. But on your third check, they found something else. Again, it wasn't in the least obtrusive. In someone else, they mightn't have given it a second look. But it didn't fit at all with your major personality patterns. You wanted to stay where you were." "Stay where I was?" "In the Manon system." "Oh." Trigger flushed a little. "Well, I know. Let's go on a moment. We had this inharmonious inclination, so we told Commissioner Tate to bring you to the hub and keep you there, to see what would happen. And on McCadden, in just a few weeks, you'd begun working that moderate inclination to be back in the Manon system up to a dandy first-rate compulsion." Trigger licked her lips. Sure," said Pilch. "You had to have a good, sensible reason. You gave yourself one." Well. Oh, you were fond of that young man, all right. Who wouldn't be? Wonderful-looking lug. I'd go for him myself, till I got him on that couch, that is. But that was the first time you hadn't been able to stand a couple of months away from him. It was also the first time you'd started worrying about competition. You now had your justification. And we, Pilch said darkly, had a fine, solid compulsion, with no doubt very revealing ramifications to it to work on. Just one thing went wrong with that, Trigger. You don't have the compulsion anymore. Oh? You don't even, said Pilch, have the original moderate inclination. Now one might have some suspicions there, but we'll let them ride for the moment. She did something on the desk. The huge wall screen suddenly lit up, a soft, amber-glowing plane of blankness with a suggestion of receding depths within it. "Last night, shortly before you woke up," Pilch said, "you had a dream. Actually, you had a series of 8 dreams during the night which seem pertinent here, but the earlier ones were rather vague preliminary structures. In one way and another, their content is included in this final symbol grouping. Let's see what we can make of them." A shape appeared on the screen. Trigger started, then laughed. "What do you make of it?" Pilch asked. "A little green man," she said. "Well, it could be a sort of counterpart to the little yellow thing on the ship, couldn't it? A good little dwarf and a very bad little dwarf." "Could be," said Pilch. "How do you feel about the notion?" "Good plasmoids and bad plasmoids?" Trigger shook her head. "No, it doesn't feel right." "What else feels right?" Pilch asked. "The farmer. The little old man who owned the farm where the mud pond was." "Liked him, didn't you?" "Very much. He knew a lot of fascinating things." She laughed again. "You know, I'd hate to have him find out, but that little green man also reminds me quite a bit of Commissioner Tate." "I don't think he'd mind hearing it," Pilch said. She paused a moment. "All right, what's this?" A second shape appeared. "A sort of caricature of a wild, mean horse," Trigger said. She added thoughtfully, "There was a horse like that on that farm, too. I suppose you know that?" "Yes. Any thoughts about it?" "No. Well, one. The little farmer was the only one who could handle that horse. It was mutated horse, actually, one of the life bank deals that didn't work out so well. Enormously strong. It could work 48 hours at a stretch without even noticing it. But it was just a plain, mean animal." "Crazy mean," observed Pilch, was the dream feeling about it. Trigger nodded. "I remember I used to think it was crazy for that horse to want to go around kicking and biting things to pieces, which was about all it really wanted to do. I imagine it was crazy at that." "You weren't ever in any danger from it yourself, were you?" Trigger laughed. "I couldn't have got anywhere near it. You should have seen the kind of place the old farmer kept it when it wasn't working." "I did," said Pilch. "Long, wide, straight-walled pit in the ground. Cover for shade, plenty of food, running water. He was a good farmer. Very high locked fence around it to keep little girls and anyone else from getting too close to his useful monster." "Right," said Trigger. She shook her head. "When you people look into somebody's mind, you look." "We work at it," Pilch said. "Let's see what you can do with this one." Trigger was silent for almost a minute before she said in a subdued voice, "I just get what it shows. It doesn't seem to mean anything." "What does it show?" "Laughing giants stamping on a farm. A tiny sort of farm. It looks like it might be the little green man's farm. No, wait, it's not his. But it belongs to other little green people." "How do you feel about that?" "Well, I hate those giants," Trigger said. "They're cruel. And they laugh about being cruel." "Are you afraid of them?" Trigger blinked at the screen for a few seconds. "No," she said in a low, sleepy voice. "Not yet." Pilch was silent a moment. She said then, "One more." Trigger looked and frowned. Presently she said, "I have a feeling that does mean something. But all I get is that it's the faces of two clocks. One of them the hands are going around very fast, and on the other they go around slowly." "Yes," Pilch said. She waited a little. "No other thought about those clocks? Just that they should mean something?" Trigger shook her head. "That's all." Pilch's hand moved on the desk again. The wall screen went blank, and the light in the little room brightened slowly. Pilch's face was reflective. "That will have to do for now," she said. "Trigger, this ship is working on an urgent job somewhere else. We'll have to go back and finish that job. But I'll be able to return to Manon in about 10 days, and then we'll have another session. And I think that will get this little mystery cleared up." "All of it?" "All of it, I'd say. The whole pattern seems to be moving into view. More details will show up in the 10-day interval, and one more cautious boost then should bring it out in full." Trigger nodded. "That's good news. I've been getting a little fed up with being a kind of walking enigma." "Don't blame you at all," Pilch said, sounding almost exactly like Commissioner Tate. "Incidentally, you're a busy lady at present, but if you do have half an hour to spare from time to time, you might just sit down comfortably somewhere and listen to yourself thinking. The way things are going, that should bring quite a bit of information to view." Trigger looked doubtful. "Listen to myself thinking?" "You'll find yourself getting the knack of it rather quickly," Pilch said. She smiled. "Just head off in that general direction whenever you find the time, and don't work too hard at it. Are there any questions now before we start back to Manon?" Trigger studied her a moment. "There's one thing I'd like to be sure about," she said. "But I suppose you people have your problems with security too." "Who doesn't?" said Pilch. "You're secure enough for me. Fire away." "All right," Trigger said. "Commissioner Tate told me people like you don't work much with individuals." "Not as much as we'd like to, that's true." "So, you wouldn't have been working with me if whatever has been going on weren't somehow connected with the plasmoids?" "Oh yes, I would," said Pilch. "Or old Crenaden. Someone like that. We do give service as required when somebody has the good sense to ask for it. But obviously we couldn't have dropped that other job just now and come to Manon to clear up some individual difficulty." "So I am involved with the plasmoid mess?" "You're right in the middle of it, Trigger. That's definite. In just what way is something we should be able to determine next session." Pilch turned off the desk light and stood up. "I always hate to run off and leave something half-finished like this," she admitted, "but I'll have to run anyway. The plasmoids are nowhere near the head of the Federation's problem list at present. They're just coming up mighty fast." When Trigger reached her office next morning, she learned that the Psychology Service ship had moved out of the Manon area within an hour after she'd been returned to the headquarters dome the night before. None of the members of the plasmoid team were around. The Commissioner, who had a poor opinion of sleep, had been up for the past 3 hours. He left word Trigger could reach him, if necessary, in the larger of his 2 ships, parked next to the dome in pre-call port. Presumably, he had the ship sealed up and was sitting in the transmitter cabinet, swapping messages with the I fleets in the Vishni area. He was likely to be at that for hours more. Professor Mantelish hadn't yet got back from his latest field trip, and Major Heslet Quillen just wasn't there. It looked, Trigger decided, not at all reluctantly, like a good day to lean into her pre-call job a bit. She told the staff to pitch everything not utterly routine her way and leaned. A set of vitally important reports from Precall's giant planet survey squad had been mislaid somewhere around headquarters during yesterday's conferences. She soothed down the GP squad and instituted a check search. A team of hub ecologists who had decided for themselves that outworld booster shots weren't required on Manon called in nervously from a polar station to report that their hair was falling out. Trigger tapped the Manon fever button on her desk and suggested toupees. The ecologists were displeased. A medical emergency skip boat zoomed out of the dome to go to their rescue, and Trigger gave its directions while dialing for the medical checker who'd allow the visitors to avoid their shots. She had a brief chat with the young man and left him twitching as the GP squad came back on to inquire whether the reports had been found yet. Trigger began to get a comfortable feeling of being back in the good old groove. Then a message from the medical department popped out on her desk. It was addressed to Commissioner Tate and stated that Brule Inger was now able to speak again. Trigger frowned, sighed, bit her lip, and thought a moment. She dialed for Dr. Leahaven. "Got your message," she said. "How's he doing?" "All right," the old medic said. "Has he said anything?" "No. He's scared. If he could get up the courage, he'd ask for a personnel lawyer." "Yes, I imagine. Tell him this, then, from the Commissioner, not from me. There'll be no charges, but Precol expects his resignation end of the month." "That on the level?" Dr. Leahaven demanded incredulously. "Of course." The doctor snorted. "You people are getting soft-headed, but I'll tell him." The morning went on. Trigger was suspiciously studying a traffic control note stating that a De Vegas missionary ship had checked in and berthed at the spaceport when the GC Center's management called in to report, with some nervousness, that the center's much-advertised meteor repellent roof had just flipped several dozen tons of falling moonbelt material into the spaceport area. Most of it, unfortunately, had dropped around and upon a De Vegas missionary ship. "Not damaged, is it?" she asked. The center said no, but the missionary captain insisted on speaking to the person in charge here. To whom should they refer him? "Refer him to me," Trigger said expectantly. She switched on the vision screen. The missionary captain was a tall, gray-haired, gray-eyed, square-jawed man in uniform. After confirming to his satisfaction that Trigger was indeed in charge, he informed her in chilled tones that the De Vegas Union would hold her personally responsible for the unprovoked outrage unless an apology was promptly forthcoming. Trigger apologized promptly. He acknowledged with a curt nod. "The ship will now require new space paint," he pointed out, unmollified. Trigger nodded. "We'll send a work squad out immediately." "We," the missionary captain said, "shall supervise the work. Only the best grade of paint will be acceptable." "The very best only," Trigger agreed. He gave her another curt nod and switched off. "Ass," she said. She cut in the Don't Disturb area and dialed Holati's ship. It took a while to get through. He was probably busy somewhere in the crate. Like Belchik Pluli, the commissioner, while still a very wealthy man, would have been a very much wealthier one if it weren't for his hobby. In his case, the hobby was ships, of which he now owned 2. What made them expensive was that they had been tailor-made to the commissioner's specifications, and his specifications had provided him with 2 rather exact duplicates of the 2 types of scout fighting ships in which Squadron Commander Tate had made space hideous for evildoers in the good old days. Nobody as yet had got up the nerve to point out to him that private battlecraft definitely were not allowable in the Manon system. He came on finally. Trigger told him about the De Vegas. "Did you know those characters were in the area?" she asked. The commissioner knew. They'd stopped in at the system check station 3 days before. The ship was clean. "Their missionaries all go armed, of course, but that's their privilege by treaty. They've been browsing around and going hither and yon in skiffs. The ship's been in orbit till this morning." "Think they're here in connection with whatever Balmorden is up to?" Trigger inquired. We'll take that for granted. Belmorden, by the way, attended a big shindig on the Pluley yacht yesterday. Unless his tail goofed, he's still up there, apparently staying on as a guest. Are you having these other De Vegas watched? Not individually. Too many of them, and they're scattered all over the place. Mantelish got back. He checked in an hour ago. You mean he's upstairs in his quarters now? She asked. Right. He had a few more crates hauled into the lab, and he's locked himself in with them and spy-blocked the place. May have got something important, and may just be going through one of his secrecy periods again. We'll find out by and by. Oh, and here's a special note. The First Lady of Trinest is shopping in the Grand Commerce Center this morning. Well, that should boost business, said Trigger. Are you going to be back in the dome by lunchtime? I think so. Might have some interesting news, too, incidentally. Fine, she said. See you then. 20 minutes later, the desk transmitter gave her the to-be-shielded signal. Up went the barrier again. Major Quillen's face looked out at her from the screen. He was, Trigger saw, in Mantelish's lab. Mantelish stood at a workbench behind him. Hi, he said. Hi yourself. When did you get in? Just now. Could you pick up the who'ses and whichies and bring it up here? Right now? If you can, Quillen said. The professor's got something new, he thinks. I'm on my way, said Trigger. Take about 5 minutes. She hurried down to her quarters, summoned Repulsive's container into the room, and slung the strap over her shoulder. Then she stood still a moment, frowning slightly. Something like a wisp of memory, something she should be remembering, was stirring in the back of her mind. Then it was gone. Trigger shook her head. It would keep. She opened the door and stepped out into the hall. She fell down. As she fell, she tried to give the bag the send-off squeeze, but she couldn't move her fingers. She couldn't move anything. There were people around her. They were doing things swiftly. She was turned over on her back, and for a few moments then, she saw her own face smiling down at her from just a few feet away. End of Chapter 20.